Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean, historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. The Orphan's Tale by Emma Ashwood. The Prologue. The 1880s in Chicago was a decade of change and burgeoning industry. But for Poppy Brown, it was life as normal. She'd just finished another day in her mother and father's haberdashery and was looking forward to a quiet evening of embroidering beside the fire, or perhaps playing dolls with her sister. Poppy, dear, could you cut the last of that red ribbon and leave it behind the counter before you leave? Mrs. Ellis said she's going to collect it tomorrow. Poppy turned back toward her mother, who was leaning over the wooden counter, surrounded by offcuts of ribbon and fabric as she tallied up the day's earnings. Her brow creased into a frown. Poppy had always thought her mother was the most beautiful woman in the world, even at the end of the workday, when, like today, her hair was a bit messy and her cheeks a little flushed. It only added to her charm. Poppy didn't think the more high and mighty ladies who came into the shop held a candle to her mother. By the way in which Poppy's father was looking at his wife from across the shop as he put away the model hats, she thought he agreed. Of course, Mother. I'll see to it right away. 5 minutes later, Poppy was out on the street, walking around to the back of the shop, where a metal flight of stairs led to the family's home on the second floor of the tenement building. Poppy could hear the quiet thumps and squeals of her siblings as they played with their toys under the watchful eye of their neighbor from down the street, Mrs. Caterino. The aroma suggested that Mrs. Caterino had put a stew on to cook for them, as she sometimes did. Poppy could almost taste the savory broth as she opened the door. Though her parents still treated her like a child, she had observed enough at the shop to know that their financial situation was tenuous. Some weeks they were able to afford meat and 2 or even 3 varieties of vegetables and bread, while on others their table held only hard crackers and cheese. It was during those weeks that Mrs. Caterino, whose husband was a successful merchant, prepared them a stew to keep the family fed. "Poppy, you're home," little Ellie and Jacob cried, jumping up from where they were lying on the floor. They looked at her with such open adoration that Poppy couldn't resist lifting them both up for a quick hug before turning to Mrs. Caterino. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Caterino. My mother and father should be home soon, so I can watch the children now." "Is that your famous stew on the stove that I can smell?" Poppy asked, indicating with a motion of her head toward the large steaming pot on the stove over in the corner of the room. "Yes, it is, girl, and a good thing, too. You need fattening up. The whole Brown family, much too thin. Tell your mama and papa I said hello, yes?" Mrs. Caterino said as she rose from the wooden chair she'd taken possession of while the children played. "I will. I'll see you tomorrow." "Yes, you will, child. Don't forget to say your prayers this evening. That influenza's coming, and I heard Mr. French down the road has just come down with it." Poppy nodded obligingly and closed the door once she was sure that Mrs. Caterino had made her way safely down the steps and back toward her own dwelling. A few minutes later, Poppy's parents entered the apartment, and they all sat down at the small table on the far right of the room to sup and chat about their day. It was one in a slew of perfect evenings that had made up Poppy's childhood, but it would also be the last of them. The very next day, her parents came down with the dreaded influenza. 2 weeks later, her father was dead, and her mother followed soon after. Poppy, a girl of just 14, was left to care for her siblings, to become a parent to them when she still needed a parent herself. Chapter 1. "A few cents so I can feed my family, miss?" Poppy asked the high-bred woman walking by. Poppy was standing on Jackson Street near the exhibition building, hoping to beg enough coin from passers-by to afford to feed Ellie and Jacob that night. They had eaten nothing but oranges and apples over the past 3 days, which the fruitmonger had given her as he'd passed by her parents' old storefront. He used to know her mother and father and took pity on her and her siblings now that they were poor orphans. He couldn't spare much, but he gave her what he could. It was usually enough to tide them all over until Poppy could beg enough money for a chunk of bread and cheese. But today was Poppy's fifth consecutive day of begging, while her siblings were tucked away in the tenement apartment in which they only had occupancy for 3 more days. Not only were they out of food, but the rent was nearly due, and Poppy was starting to realize that she wouldn't be able to pay it. She'd already pawned all her mother's jewelry, the furniture, and most of Ellie and Jacob's toys, much to their dismay, but she still didn't have nearly enough to cover the cost of another month of shelter, let alone an evening meal. She'd only received 2 pennies so far that day, and the sun was beginning to set. The cold wind slipped through her threadbare clothes and seemed to settle in her bones as she stood with her hand outstretched, waiting for someone to drop a cold, hard penny in her palm. She didn't have the energy to think about her dead mother and father and the sallow hue of their skin as she'd nursed them to their deaths. Right now, she had to focus on the family she had left, making sure they didn't fall ill too. As matters now stood, they were more likely to succumb to starvation than influenza. A cough racked Poppy's chest as she stood, and for a moment she was forced to double over from the onslaught, trying to hack up whatever was in her lungs. When she righted herself, she felt dizzy. The world began to spin in front of her, and suddenly everything went black. Poppy came to on the street with night having long since fallen. The stars were out, and it was by their light that she made her way back to the tenement, though it took longer than normal because her breathing was labored. She made it up the steps and through the front door before she collapsed again, coughing and gasping for breath. "Poppy?" Ellie cried, jumping up off the blankets she and Jacob had been curled up in. Poppy couldn't get up. She could barely muster the strength to open her eyes. For 3 days, Poppy faded in and out of a fever-induced stupor, waking only to cough up what felt like pieces of her lung before she fell back asleep. Ellie and Jacob did their best to care for her, but the 7- and 5-year-old knew nothing more than to give her water and feed her the crusts of bread Ellie managed to beg off the baker down the street. The children didn't quite understand death or why their mother and father hadn't come back. But they knew enough to know that if Poppy died, they would be alone, perhaps for a very long time. When Poppy finally awoke a few days later, it was to a knock on the door. The landlord of the building was standing outside. "Time's up. Either pay the rent or get out." Poppy looked back into the apartment, which was bare of everything but her 2 siblings, a blanket, and a small tin cup full of water. It was time for them to leave. Poppy gathered their meager belongings into a small canvas bag her mother had used to carry sewing and led her siblings down the steps and away from what had once been their family home. They wandered the streets all day, looking for a place to stay for the night. When it was nearly dark and the winter wind was becoming all the more biting, Jacob pointed out a church they'd missed on their first meander down the empty street. The church had the name St. Vincent emblazoned in large letters on its front, and the small plaque near the door read, "Orphanage for Disadvantaged Youth. All young souls welcome." Poppy supposed that she and her siblings now qualified as disadvantaged, and so she knocked on the door. After a few minutes, the wrinkled, pale face of an old woman appeared in the crack of the open door. "Yes?" she croaked, peering suspiciously at Poppy and her siblings. "My sister, brother, and I have come to ask for your help. We're orphans, you see, and—" But before Poppy could finish, the woman had swung the door open and gestured for them to proceed inside. Come in, and out of the cold, my dears." The old woman introduced herself as Mrs. Julian, the headmistress of the orphanage. She told them that St. Vincent's was always taking new admissions, and went on to give them a tour, showing them the beds in which they would sleep, the dining hall where they would eat, and the schoolroom in which they would learn their letters and numbers. Poppy had only ever been taught by her mother and was excited at the possibility of proper schooling. They had arrived just as dinner was served, so Mrs. Julian told them they could change into the required uniform after they had finished their meal. She led them back toward the dining room, which was now starting to fill with children, all of whom were looking down at the floor. The girls had their hair severely braided in tight braids, and the boys' heads were all closely shaved. Poppy looked down at Jacob's head, his beautiful auburn hair visible even in the dim light of the dining room, and nearly shed a tear at the loss of his locks. But that was not nearly all she had to worry about. None of the children spoke. Not one word was uttered after grace was said, and everyone tucked into the bland food that had been sparingly ladled onto each plate. Poppy was astounded by the silence, as well as the looks in the children's eyes. They looked at her in fear, as if she was an unknown monster who had invaded their home. But she would come to learn in later weeks that they were looking with terror, not at her, but for her, for they knew what St. Vincent's Orphanage had in store for her, and it was not religious charity. Chapter 2. Scrub harder, girl. Mrs. Julian yelled at Poppy as she kneeled on the cold tile floor of the kitchen, scrubbing at a non-existent patch of grime. She'd been scrubbing that particular patch of floor for 15 minutes and still had the entirety of the kitchen left to clean. Mrs. Julian had berated her for distracting her enough to spill the watery milk she'd been using to make the stew for the evening meal, and now Poppy was being forced to clean up the woman's mess. This was nothing new, however. Since Poppy and her siblings had arrived at St. Vincent 4 months ago, she'd been subjected to repeated abuse, both verbal and physical, from Mrs. Julian, in addition to extra chores and smaller meals as punishment for their bad behavior. Of course, to Mrs. Julian, bad behavior could be anything from sneezing incorrectly to mispronouncing seraph during Bible study. If possible, Jacob and Ellie had it even worse. They had always been raised in a particularly caring environment. Their only caretakers, Mrs. Caterino and her daughter-in-law Maria, both doted on them like the darlings they were. They weren't used to strict rules, and as a result, transgressed more than most of the orphans their age. The orphanage masters, overseen by Mrs. Ta, Julian had beaten them a few times before Poppy realized what was happening and requested to be beaten in their stead. A request Mrs. Julian was more than happy to oblige. As a result, Poppy's back and bottom were covered in switch marks, her hands were raw from so many lashes with the ruler, and her right ear was severely wounded from being clocked. However, as 1 year in the orphanage turned into 2 and then 3, Poppy was beginning to accept this as her fate. She was a poor, parentless teenager. If or when she, Ellie, and Jacob did manage to leave the orphanage, their fate would not change. Without the support of their parents, they were destined for a life of poverty and sadness. No family, no money, and only each other for support, or so she thought. Because while Poppy and her siblings toiled away, the uncle they never knew about was looking for them. David Brown was their father's older brother. He and Edward had fallen out long before the children were born, over a fight about their mother, Sarah. David had met Sarah out at the market one day while buying a newspaper as a young man and had immediately fallen in love with her. He'd gone home to tell Edward that he'd found the woman he was going to marry. But when he walked into the parlor of their home in Chicago, it was to find Sarah seated across from Edward. She was the beautiful, shy girl Edward had been telling David he was planning to court. There were so many women named Sarah in Chicago that David hadn't made the connection. He begged Edward not to marry her, lying and saying that she was no good for him. The day following Edward and Sarah's wedding, David left Chicago, heartbroken and angry with his brother. He and Edward never again spoke for the rest of Edward's life. It took many months for news of Edward's death to reach David, who was living in Gloucestershire, England. He had sent word to the old family solicitor in Chicago, inquiring as to David's whereabouts. He wanted to return home to America in the knowledge that upon his return, he could finally make amends with his brother. But after reading the reply from his solicitor, David was dumbstruck. His brother dead? And Sarah too? The loss overwhelmed him until he read the final lines of the letter and realized that he had 2 nieces and a nephew. David realized that while he couldn't make up for the terrible manner in which he had treated Edward and, by extension, Sarah, he could take care of their children. But when David wrote back to his solicitor asking after his brother's children, He was to learn that no one had any idea where the Brown children had been living since their parents' deaths. David made a decision. He would journey to America and find them himself to give them the life they deserved. While in England, he had made more money than he could possibly spend, and it only seemed right to use it to take care of and spoil his brother's children. It was the least he could do. Sadly, settling his affairs in England took months, as did the journey to America. By the time David set sail on the Atlantic Ocean, Poppy and her siblings had been living in the orphanage for 4 years. They were shells of their former selves, terrified of stepping out of line and receiving the harsh beatings that had become Mrs. Julian's specialty the older she grew. She seemed to gain strength and energy from physically punishing children, and Poppy knew they needed to escape the orphanage to avoid being the target of Mrs. Julian's attack when she eventually became overzealous and truly hurt her sister or brother. Thankfully, her 18th birthday was fast approaching, at which time she would be forced to leave the orphanage because she was no longer a child. The problem, however, was that she couldn't take Ellie and Jacob with her. Though Mrs. Julian had told Poppy when she first arrived that children at the orphanage were free to leave at any time, this was a patent falsehood. St. Vincent's was a workhouse, ostensibly run to keep the church that housed it in working order. The fact of the matter, however, was that Mrs. Julian had turned it into a profitable little operation. The younger children scrubbed the floors, made the beds, and peeled the potatoes, while the older ones, the ones with the bigger hands, handled the laundry that was dropped at the church's doorstep from sunup to sundown 6 days a week. Poppy's hands, once delicate and beautiful, were now raw and red from time spent in the hot, astringent, soapy water. She knew that when she left, Ellie, who was now 11, would be forced to take her place, and Poppy just couldn't bear the idea of her sweet young sister's hands being scalded day in and day out. It wasn't fair. No child, no matter their standing, should have to work like this. Poppy had to find a way to remove them to a place of safety, somewhere Mrs. Julian would never find them because she would never let Ellie and Jacob leave. They were too good at working and far too obedient to let go. Thankfully, Poppy was not completely alone. Just before her 17th birthday, a young nun had joined the staff at St. Vincent's, a nun by the name of Sister Miller. Petite, with wise blue eyes and a soft voice, Sister Miller gave the children of the orphanage the love and kindness they so desperately needed and deserved. Whenever Mrs. Julian and her band of orphanage masters had their backs turned, Sister Miller would slip the children the candy she smuggled in from the market, brush the dirt from their eyes, and give their hands a loving squeeze. Though the children still kept their eyes glued to the floor and their mouths shut when Mrs. Julian was around, when Sister Miller passed by, they were able to, for the briefest of moments, become true children, delighting in jokes, salivating at treats, and skipping down the hallway hand in hand with her. She had changed St. Vincent's for the better, and Poppy was sad to leave her. But you must leave, Poppy, before your birthday. You are all Ellie and Jacob have in the world, and you need to protect them. You know what Mrs. Julian does to children once their older siblings have gone, Sister Miller whispered to Poppy as they worked in the laundry one day. The constant whooshing of the soapy water in the huge vats in which their hands were now submerged helped to mask their voices from the orphanage master off to the side of the room. Poppy nodded. She did indeed know just what Mrs. Julian was capable of. She'd heard the screams in the middle of the night from poor Jack Adams and Millie Fortescue, whose older siblings had left the orphanage the year before. She didn't want to think about the cause of their torment, but she knew that whatever it was, she couldn't subject Ellie and Jacob to it. I know. You're right, sister, but I don't know what to do. Even if we did escape, where would we go? We have no family and no connections. We'd be back out on the streets again, and winter will be here soon. I can't risk it. Poppy scrubbed at a nightgown for a few moments while she pondered, but then an idea struck her. She turned to Sister Miller. I know, we can escape together. You're always saying how you wish you could leave this place. Let's journey out into cold, dark Chicago together. There must be a benevolent convent that will take us in, After all, you'd be one of their sisters. They can't turn you away. Sister Miller looked at Poppy with the deepest sadness in her eyes. Oh, Poppy, you know how much I wish I could leave, but I can't. I'm the only source of kindness and goodwill these children have. I can't leave them to Mrs. Julian and her crones. I just can't. But I do have an idea of what you could do. While Poppy was sad that leaving the orphanage would also mean leaving her only friend, she leaned in and listened closely to what Sister Miller had to say. There was a young nun in the convent where I was ordained by the name of Sister Hart. Her friend applied to be a mail-order bride out west to escape their abusive father. I believe she found the advertisement for a bride in a newspaper. Mrs. Julian wants me to go to the market tomorrow to get potatoes and fish, and I could try to smuggle just such a newspaper in my cassock. We could look through for advertisements for brides out that way. If you went out west, Mrs. Julian wouldn't be able to find you or your siblings. While the idea of marrying a man she'd never met didn't sit well with Poppy, the idea of being so far away that Mrs. Julian couldn't possibly find her and hurt her or her siblings did. And besides, as the adult in the family, the only adult, she had to make sacrifices for the care and safety of Ellie and Jacob. Okay, let's try it. Chapter 3. It took over 2 months for Poppy and Sister Miller to find a seemingly suitable mail-order bride advertisement. Sister Miller had snuck a great many different newspapers in for Poppy to look through, burning them immediately after in the small grate in her room to avoid Mrs. Julian finding them. Sister Miller wasn't supposed to read anything but the Bible while under St. Vincent's roof. She risked expulsion from her position if contraband reading material was discovered among her possessions, so she truly was risking her career to help her friend. It was nonetheless a risk she felt was worth taking to see Poppy and her siblings to safety. Maybe she couldn't help every child escape St. Vincent's, but helping 2 would allow her to rest a little easier at night. On a cold, windy October day, while out at the market buying apples, Sister Miller finally found a newspaper that she suspected offered what she believed to be the perfect advertisement. She showed it to Poppy, who agreed. It almost looks too good to be true. But Poppy answered the advertisement anyway. After all, she only had another month and a half until her birthday. Time was of the essence. The advertisement was posted by a rancher in Texas who was a widower and went by the name of Mason Brodie. He answered Poppy's first letter promptly, assuring her that he had never in his life thought he'd be looking for a bride in the newspaper. He explained that following the death of his wife, Elizabeth, he knew he needed help to run his ranch and household. Poppy and Mason began a regular correspondence. Poppy's first letter warned him to please sign his letters not as himself, but as Sister Agnes from Our Lady of Worship, Texas. Sister Miller lied to Mrs. Julian by saying that her sister had found the Lord and was now a nun in Texas. Mrs. Julian believed her because Sister Miller was good and kind and usually honest, so she thought nothing of it when the nun began receiving letters from the convent in Texas. These letters helped Poppy get to know the kind-hearted man that was Mason Brodie. Mason told Poppy about his late wife. Mason had met Elizabeth at a town dance in his native Texas. He'd thought she was the most beautiful woman in the room, while at first she thought him arrogant and aloof. He had spent over a year proving to her otherwise until they were finally wed. Elizabeth had been warm and kind, good at storytelling, and a genius with a sewing needle. She and Mason had passed the cold desert nights by the fire, Mason reading to her from one of the few books in his treasured collection, while Elizabeth mended his shirts and darned his socks. But with Elizabeth gone, Mason was overwhelmed. She had cooked and cleaned for him, and without her, Mason didn't know how to manage the ranch duties along with the housekeeping. Poppy told Mason how excited she was about the possibility of moving out west. She had never been out of Chicago and looked forward to seeing more of the world. Poppy had grown up with her mother and father's stories of their travels, of when they first met working in Boston at the same haberdashery. They'd courted for a few weeks before marrying and had visited New York for their honeymoon. Poppy's mother told her that Boston was steeped in history, with every street corner the site of some important event from the American Revolution. Poppy's father drew her a map of New York, pointing out the bakery he and her mother had frequented while there. Tasting delectable speculoos cookies and apfel tart dripping in butter and crisp sugared apples, those cities sounded like such wonderful, exciting places. And even if she couldn't visit those cities, Poppy was ready to leave Chicago. Though it had been her only home, the last few years had tainted her view of the city. It would always be the place where her parents had died, the place where she and her siblings had spent some of the most miserable years in imagination. Perhaps one day she would come back and visit, and the city would feel new and exciting to her again, stripped of the sadness that seemed to weigh down its streets and doorsteps. But for now, Poppy was ready to leave and take her siblings with her. Although Poppy's reasons for becoming a mail-order bride were in part to save her siblings, she didn't tell Mason about Ellie and Jacob. Sister Miller had warned that any mention of them might scare Mason with the prospect of too many mouths to feed and too many new people in his care, while he really only sought one wife. It's best to woo him first and then introduce the idea. That way he already loves you, and it's easier for him to love the idea of 2 children. The mention of love confused Poppy, though. The only love between 2 adults she'd ever seen was the love her parents had shared, and that had been born of years of marriage and close partnership from running the haberdashery business. How could Mason possibly love her without meeting her, without seeing her, without really knowing her? Chapter 4. While Poppy was contemplating the reality behind her relationship with Mason, Mason was navigating his delicate and often tempestuous relationship with his former father-in-law. He and Elliot Turner had gotten along so well when they first met, even before Elizabeth took a liking to him. Elliot had considered Mason a stable, smart, capable man, and the perfect mate for Elizabeth. He'd encouraged the union, and had in fact been one of the deciding factors in Elizabeth accepting Mason's courtship and his eventual proposal of marriage. "He'll take care of you, Lizzie. Good men like him are hard to find," he had told his daughter. Oh, how he would come to regret that statement. Now, more than a year after the death of his beloved wife, Mason's relationship with Elliot had deteriorated completely. Elliot hated him, perhaps more so because there was so little about Mason to hate. After taking over the Turner Ranch from Elliot, Mason had made it profitable after years of failed crops, ranch hands leaving, and the constant raising of cattle unsuitable for sale. The Turner family was nearing destitution before Mason married Elizabeth and turned the Turner Ranch from a profit sinkhole into a solid investment. Elliot had gifted part ownership of the ranch to Mason a year after their marriage, as a reward for turning the biggest annual profit in more than a decade. Mason was a good and fair ranch co-owner. He was organized and from an agricultural family that knew the ins and outs of the dry Texas land on which the Turner Cattle Ranch sat. With Mason at the helm, Elliot had been able to take a step back from the business and focus on his family for the first time in over 15 years. Elizabeth had 2 younger sisters and an older brother who had a young child of his own. Elliot was finally able to visit with his family for more than a few hours every day. He read with his daughters, played with his grandson, and finally got used to the silence of his house. His wife had died more than a decade before when Elizabeth was a young girl, and rather than wallowing in his grief, Elliot had thrown himself into his work, neglecting his family in the process. But thanks to Mason and his exceptional management of the ranch, Elliot finally had the chance to grieve for his wife, accept her loss, and learn to live without her. All that had changed after Elizabeth's death. Elliot blamed Mason for Elizabeth's passing. After all, if the brutish, oversized Mason hadn't impregnated Elizabeth with Rosie, who was difficult from the moment she'd begun to grow in her mother's belly, Lizzie would still be alive, and Elliot wouldn't have had to deal with the loss of yet another beloved woman. Mason was the reason he couldn't sleep at night, the reason he heard his daughter's voice in the quiet dark of early dawn. He needed to go, and Elliot knew just how to make sure he left Turner Ranch and never came back. "I'm going to sell it right out from under his nose, And then I'm finally going to escape this place. Find somewhere new where none of my women have died and my business isn't being run by a thief, Elliot told his son Thomas one night over dinner in early November. Father, Mason is no thief, Thomas countered, feeling the exasperation familiar to all encounters with his father begin to seep into his face. Elliot scoffed. He stole my Elizabeth. He's stealing my business. He's a thief, I tell you. Thomas tried to reason with his father, which was no small feat. You gave him Elizabeth's hand willingly, and none of us were to know she would die in that way, in childbirth. It was no one's fault. The midwife even said so. Don't you remember? Elliot ignored his son, staring into the glass of whiskey in front of him on the kitchen table of his large ranch house. He was muttering to himself, vicious slander about Mason, no doubt. Thomas tried one more time to reason with him. Father, you can't leave. I understand why you're upset with Mason, but what about little Rosie? She's your flesh and blood, and all we have left of Lizzie. Isn't she worth cherishing, worth staying for? She's your granddaughter. Isn't she worth working things out with Mason? After all, if you sell the ranch, you sell her livelihood. How will Mason feed her, clothe her, school her, if you take away his only source of income? Thomas asked, though he knew these questions fell on deaf ears. His father had grown spiteful and bitter in the year since his Lizzie's death. Thomas was glad that he and his remaining sisters had moved off the ranch to a neighboring town. They only visited once a month, and that was more than enough to see that his father was becoming a truly vindictive man. Elliot's vindictive streak was indeed clear when he finally answered his son after many more gulps of cheap whiskey. I have no granddaughter. All I have is a hole in my heart left by Lizzie's death. The only way that hole is going to be fixed is if I get my revenge on the man who killed her. Thomas shook his head sadly, fearing that his father was truly lost to dark, devilish ways devoid of the Christian charity he had been so intent on teaching his children. While Mason was unaware of his father-in-law's plan to sell the ranch out from under him, he knew he had to somehow mend his relationship with Elliot. But he didn't know how, and his attention was already far too split between the ranch, Rosie, and the woman to whom he wrote so regularly. He was short of the energy required to mend broken fences with the Turner family. Mason focused instead on his need for a wife. He knew Rosie needed a woman's touch whenever she cried at night, and nothing he did or said could calm her. He never imagined when he posted the advertisement for a mail-order bride in the Chicago Tribune that he would find a warm, caring, intelligent prospect such as Poppy Brown. Poppy was exactly what he was looking for. She was smart, a good seamstress, loved children, and seemed unafraid of the hard work required of a rancher's wife. Mason knew he could get along with her, and they could live together without drama or difficulty. Of course, he'd never be able to show Poppy the love he had shown Elizabeth. Elizabeth had been the love of his life, his soulmate, and her death had made him realize that love would not strike twice for him. He'd expended all his love on Lizzie, and he had none left for anyone but Rosie, because she was a part of Lizzie. Mason only wanted a companion to help him with Rosie and the ranch, and Poppy seemed eminently suited to the task. After 2 months of correspondence, Mason knew that Poppy was in fact the woman he had been looking for. He wanted to bring her to the ranch and help her settle into her new life, but he knew he shouldn't do so without sharing his plans with Elliot. After all, the ranch was still rightfully Elliot's, and Mason felt a duty as his partner and former son-in-law to inform him of his intentions to take on a new wife. As much as Mason wanted to be honest with Elliot, he knew that bringing a new woman onto the ranch would only remind Elliot of Elizabeth's death and the hand he thought Mason had played in it. Mason desperately needed a woman in his life, but he didn't need any more strife with the Turners. Mason deliberated for days on what to do. He prayed, he paced, he even spoke his thoughts to Rosie, who simply gurgled in response, a playful smile on her face. Finally, he decided that he would only tell Elliot when it became necessary to do so. After all, Elliot rarely visited Mason's house on the ranch. In fact, he hadn't been there since Rosie's birth, refusing to see the child he believed had caused the death of his favorite daughter, with Mason's help. Mason might be able to get away with having Poppy on the ranch for a year or more without Elliot ever cottoning on to her presence. But this was not Mason's only deception related to his prospective marriage to Poppy. He had decided not to write to Poppy about Rosie. He worried that any knowledge of an infant child would drive Poppy away. Moving across the country to the unknown and still Wild West was quite enough for a girl of her age to contend with. Mason worried that if he told her she would be traveling to him not only as a wife, but also as a new mother, she would back out of their arrangement entirely. It was better for her to find out only upon her arrival. Surely once she met Rosie and fell in love with her, the idea of motherhood would sit better. With the decision made, Mason took the next step in the process and officially asked Poppy to marry him. He was relieved when he received her response, "Yes," written in her trademark script. He arranged the marriage and sent her the money she would need to take the train to Texas, telling her that he would meet her at the train station at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the train was due in. He began to ready the house, trying to make it as warm and welcoming as possible to a new girl from a strange, faraway city. Chapter 5. Poppy counted out the dollars Mason had sent enclosed in yet another letter addressed to Sister Miller. The fare he had sent would only cover her passage, but Sister Miller had been slipping her the odd coin over the last few months, and she'd managed to save just enough to cover the train fares for Ellie and Jacob, too. Poppy couldn't believe it. As she looked down at the crisp paper dollars in her hand, she realized she was finally able to escape St. Vincent's with Ellie and Jacob by her side. A new life awaited them far away from the tragedies they'd experienced in the cold, dreary city of Chicago. There was, however, still the matter of actually leaving the orphanage, which Poppy knew wouldn't be easy. "I don't know how we're going to manage it," she whispered to Sister Miller while peeling potatoes for supper one night, just a week before her birthday. "Mrs. Julian's office is right near the entrance to the church, and you know she has the hearing of a young rabbit. How are we going to make it past her chambers without waking her?" Thankfully, Sister Miller had been ruminating on just that quandary for the past several days, and she had a plan. The back door. The kitchen maid often leaves it open at night so that she can sneak out to meet the newspaper boy down the street. "We'll sneak you 3 out that way, and Mrs. Julian will be none the wiser. You'll be on your way to Texas before she even notices your absence." Poppy looked over the mound of potato peelings before her and smiled at her friend. She would be sad to leave Sister Miller, who had shown her so much kindness, love, and friendship over the last few months. Poppy only hoped she could find someone as good once she reached Texas. Hopefully, their new hometown would have other women her age with whom she could be friends. Tuesday evening came quickly, and before Poppy knew it, it was time to escape. She'd gathered the few meager possessions she and her siblings had amassed during their time at St. Vincent's and packed them in 3 small bags that she had stashed under her bed. They'd all faked colds that day, so Mrs. Julian had allowed them to sleep in the infirmary to decrease the risk of infecting the other children. It was therefore easy for Poppy to quickly dress her siblings and tie their little sacks onto their backs. Jacob was swaying with sleepiness as Poppy secured his belt and tied his scuffed, thin shoes, and Ellie looked around nervously as if she feared Mrs. Julian would jump out from behind the cart of medical supplies beside her. Poppy kneeled in front of her siblings. "I know this seems frightening, but we're on our way to a new place for new adventures. We get to ride on a train and see the Great Plains and cows and all sorts of other fun things the West has to offer. But in order to get there, we must be quiet. We cannot make a sound as we go towards the kitchen. Do you understand?" she asked, looking expectantly into her siblings' eyes. Jacob and Ellie nodded gravely. Poppy hadn't told them that she was getting married. Rather, she had told them they were going to stay with a long-lost family friend in Texas, a friend with whom she had only recently made contact. She was not entirely sure how she would eventually explain that she was going to be someone's wife, but at the moment, that was the least of her worries. The greatest was that Mrs. Julian would find them and try to snatch Ellie and Jacob away, so as not to lose 3 workers in one night. Poppy's birthday was not for another 2 days, and she knew through Sister Miller that Mrs. Julian had not yet arranged for her replacement. The head orphanage mistress would therefore be livid when she woke to realize that 3 of her best and most diligent workers had escaped in the night. Poppy couldn't allow herself to get scared. Not now. She had to focus on getting them all out of the church grounds to safety. The train station was not far away, and they could spend the night huddled for warmth in the station shelter, awaiting their 9 o'clock train the next morning, the train that would take them to safety. Sister Miller knocked softly on the infirmary door, signaling that it was time for them to go. Poppy placed a soft kiss on the forehead of each of her siblings, then laced her fingers with theirs and walked toward the door. "Ready?" she asked. They nodded. Sister Miller opened the door just as they reached it. "Everything is ready. Come with me." Poppy, Ellie, and Jacob followed Sister Miller down the steps from the infirmary, making sure to make as little noise as possible as their feet landed on the cold marble. From the staircase, they turned right, down the dim hallway that led to the kitchen. The maid had, as predicted, left the door open, and a cold breeze seeped in through the door, which was propped open with a small rock. Sister Miller turned back to them when they had reached the door and gave them a small package wrapped in cloth. "Bread and cheese for the train journey." Poppy took the package and set it aside so that she could hug her friend. She saw Sister Miller wipe a tear from her eye before pulling away. "Be safe. I'll pray that everything goes well," Sister Miller whispered before kissing Poppy on the cheek. After Ellie and Jacob had given Sister Miller a quick hug, she shooed them all through the door, worrying that Mrs. Julian would somehow hear them and investigate noises in the kitchen so late at night. Sister Miller's worst fears were confirmed when, just as Jacob followed his sisters out the door, Mrs. Julian ran into the room. "Stop! Stop this very instant! Stop, I say!" She yelled at Jacob, who was standing dumbstruck in the kitchen doorway. "Go, Jacob, run!" Sister Miller said, but it was too late. Mrs. Julian had grabbed Jacob's arm and was twisting it. Jacob cried out in pain, and the noise alerted Poppy and Ellie, who realized what was going on and rushed back to help him. "Get off him!" Poppy yelled, reaching to pry Mrs. Julian's fingers from where they were clamped around Jacob's small arm. "No, I will not have you escaping your home after everything I've done for you 3. Ungrateful little wretches," Mrs. Julian yelled. Poppy, Ellie, and Sister Miller were so focused on helping Jacob that they did not see Mrs. Julian reach for the knife on the counter behind her. It was too late by the time they realized her intentions, and the 3 girls watched in horror as Mrs. Julian brought the butt of the knife down onto poor Jacob's head. Blood immediately poured from the wound, and Jacob lost the strength in his legs, slowly falling to the floor. Poppy looked down in horror at her poor brother. Ellie and Sister Miller rushed to help him, lifting him and trying to blot the blood with the edge of Sister Miller's cassock. But while Poppy wanted to help her brother, she wanted revenge more. "How dare you?" she cried as she lunged at Mrs. Julian, who was standing in shock over Jacob. Poppy knocked the old woman to the floor. Mrs. Julian hit her head on the side of the table behind her and fell to the kitchen floor with a great crash. Her eyes closed and her limbs fell limp, and Poppy knew what she had done. She had killed her. That much was clear, since she could not see her chest rising and falling with breath, and the blood was slowly seeping from the gash on her head. Poppy looked around, hopeless and appalled, and not knowing what to do. She made eye contact with Sister Miller, who had stood up from her kneeling position beside Jacob. "It's all right," Sister Miller whispered to her as she walked toward her friend. "You didn't mean it. You were doing what you had to do to keep your family safe. It's not your fault, Poppy." Poppy nodded slowly. She couldn't believe she had just killed Mrs. Julian. Yes, the woman had been inexcusably cruel to every child in her care in the orphanage, but Poppy still couldn't quite believe that the woman who had caused her so much pain and suffering was dead, and because of her. Sister Miller gathered Poppy into a hug and whispered in her ear, "Don't blame yourself, Poppy. Mrs. Julian would have killed Jacob if you hadn't stopped her. You did the right thing. It was an accident that you killed her, but you did the right thing. Now go. Take the long way to the train station and calm yourself. You need to be strong for Jacob and Ellie now. Do you understand?" Poppy nodded again and squeezed her friend tightly, letting a few tears drop from her lashes before she pulled back. Poppy avoided looking in the direction of Mrs. Julian's body as she lifted Jacob off the ground and held him in her arms. He seemed to be unconscious, and his dead weight was heavy in Poppy's arms, but she couldn't risk him walking and possibly exacerbating his injury. She'd settle him in her arms when they got to the train station, and hopefully a few hours' sleep would help him. It had to. Poppy didn't know any other way to heal him. They had neither the time nor the money to go to a hospital, not when they had a train to catch. "Now, run and be safe. I'll keep you in my prayers, my darlings," Sister Miller said as Poppy helped Ellie stand and ushered her out the kitchen door. Poppy turned around for one last glance at her friend, the only one she'd ever had. She gave Sister Miller a sad smile as she stepped out the door and laced her fingers in Ellie's small ones. It was time for them to leave St. Vincent's. Sister Miller watched them walk down the alley that led to the street and crossed herself, praying to God that they would get to Texas safe and sound. It was what they deserved. A new life in a new place without the horrible pain that had followed them like a shadow these past few years. Once she saw them step onto the street and turn left toward the train station, Sister Miller turned to face the body of her former employer. Now that her friends were gone, it was time to decide what to do with Mrs. Julian. At least the children in the orphanage would now be safe from her wrath. That was something to be thankful for on this terrible, terrible night. Chapter 6. Poppy's arms were nearly numb by the time they reached the train station, and she relished the opportunity to finally put Jacob down. She and Ellie settled close together under the shelter of the train station, providing each other with as much warmth as they could, with Jacob stretched out on her lap so that she could properly inspect his wound. It was even worse than she had feared. A large, deep bloody gash split the top of Jacob's skull, and his breathing was slow and uneven. Poppy wrapped him in her arms and asked Ellie to pray with her. Pray to God that Jacob survived the train journey. The three vulnerable siblings passed a long, cold night under the shelter of the train station. Finally, long after the sun had risen in the sky, the train arrived. Poppy was standing with Ellie beside her and Jacob in her arms, the tickets gripped tightly in her hand as the carriages approached the station. Poppy had never seen a train up close before and marveled at the steam-powered beast. It seemed to go on for miles, carriage after carriage passing by them as the train slowed to a stop and passengers began alighting. "All aboard the 9 train to Houston, Texas," the conductor called, and Poppy grabbed Ellie's hand and shuffled forward. Poppy showed him her ticket and paid for Ellie and Jacob's with the loose change she'd kept in one of the envelopes that had held Mason's letters. The conductor gave her 2 ticket stubs and directed her to a carriage just down the line from where she and her siblings were standing. Poppy hurried toward the carriage, eager to get them all settled in their seats and to see about getting Jacob the water he needed, both for hydration and to clean his wound. The train seats were made of soft fabric in a faded red color. Poppy sat down and moaned quietly, relishing the first comfortable seat she'd experienced in her life. Her parents' apartment offered only rickety wooden chairs, and the benches at the orphanage were of cold wood. This was the first time she'd sat down without feeling her tailbone hit wood. Despite spending 4 years at the orphanage, where she was ostensibly well-fed, Poppy had barely gained weight as she'd grown. She knew from brief glimpses of her reflection in ponds and the small mirror in the girls' bathroom in the orphanage that she was thin and malnourished. She hoped Mason wouldn't dislike her for it. Her mother had been curvy and buxom, and Poppy hoped that with good food and rest, she'd grow into having a fuller, more womanly figure that was more pleasing to the male eye. As the train departed, Poppy asked an attendant passing by whether she might have a glass of water. "Dining car," the attendant barked at her. Poppy asked Ellie to watch over Jacob while she went in search of a drink. Poppy had never been on any manner of transportation, having only ever traversed Chicago on her own 2 feet, and so she wasn't used to the gentle rocking motion of the train. She nearly fell into the lap of more than one passenger and garnered quite a few sour looks as she made her way through the carriages. She knew she was close to the dining car when the scent of freshly baked bread and food frying hit her senses. Opening the door, she was met with a flurry of people. Servers in fancy clothing, with aprons tied around their waists, flitted from one booth to the next, depositing water, coffee, and what looked to be freshly baked rolls. Poppy cautiously approached a server on the far side of the dining cart who was filling water glasses from a large glass jug. "Pardon me, sir, but could I trouble you for water? My siblings and I are quite parched." The young man looked up at Poppy with a scowl on his face, which disappeared when he got a better look at her. Poppy wondered how pathetic she must look dressed in the horrible starched dress Mrs. Julian made all the girls wear. Her shoe had a large hole in the toe and her hair was haphazardly plaited down her back. She was quite certain she looked near collapsing. She was so tired. "Of course, miss. Here you go," he said, and he handed her 4 water glasses. Poppy realized she hadn't specified how many she wanted, but the extra water would allow her to clean Jacob's wound. "Thank you," she said, giving the server her best and brightest smile before she made her way carefully back down the carriage, clamping the 4 glasses in her 2 hands. Poppy spilled some of the water on herself as she wound her way back to her siblings, but the glasses were still mostly full by the time she reached their seats. Ellie was asleep, her head leaning against the window and jostling slightly with the movement of the train. Jacob was curled up in her lap, the wound on his head turning a nasty color. They looked so peaceful that Poppy was loath to wake them, but she needed to attend to Jacob. "Jacob," she whispered, gently shaking the little boy's shoulder. Jacob slowly blinked his eyes open and looked around in confusion before slowly sitting up. "My head is sore," he whispered, as Poppy helped lift him into her lap. Ellie rustled around in her sleep, placing her hands where Jacob's head had just been and curling back up against the padded seat at her shoulder. "I know it does, my dear, but I'm going to make it better. I'm going to make you all better. Don't you worry," Poppy said. She took the cloth from around the bread and cheese and dipped it in the glass of water Poppy was now holding steady between her legs. She began washing the dried blood from Jacob's cut. He didn't seem to notice what she was doing. He was content to lie with his head resting on her thigh as she slowly and carefully wiped at the cut. It was still bleeding more than Poppy would have liked, but Poppy pressed the cloth to Jacob's head and applied pressure, hoping to stem the blood flow. She sat with Jacob's head in her hands, gazing across at the sleeping Ellie for so long that she eventually fell asleep too, her head lolling against her chest before finally coming to rest on the soft fabric of the train seat behind her. The Brown siblings spent hours in those exact positions, napping soundly as the train made its way southwest, passing by fields of wheat tipped with frost. As the day passed, the sky grew grayer until finally, just before sundown, snowflakes began to fall, landing softly on the ledge of the train window. The children slept the whole day through, unaware of the trouble that was yet to come. Chapter 7. Poppy. "Poppy," Ellie whispered to her sister, gently shaking her shoulders to wake her. Ellie had awoken to the soft rays of early dawn light streaming in through the window next to her. She looked across from her to see Poppy fast asleep with Jacob's head in her lap. Jacob looked pale and wan, and Ellie was worried about his head wound. She knew enough about injuries from her beatings at St. Vincent's to know that the wound needed more cleaning. Poppy woke slowly. She immediately sat up when she opened her eyes and saw the worried look on Ellie's face. "What's wrong?" she asked, looking around them and taking in their surroundings. Poppy had been dreaming that she was back at the haberdashery with her parents, helping her mother sew flowers and ribbons onto a large straw hat in the back, while her father handled the till up front. She had been telling her mother about her marriage to Mason Brodie when Ellie woke her. Poppy felt confused and sad because she could only see her parents in her dreams now. 4 years on, and their death still pained her greatly. "We've slept most of a day away. We need to clean Jacob's wound and eat something," Ellie said, standing up and brushing the wrinkles from her dress. Though normally heavily starched and stiff, travel and sleep had caused the fabric to soften, and the dress now resembled a crumpled cloth. Since Ellie had nothing else to wear, she did her best to make herself presentable while Poppy gently woke Jacob and began tending his wound. "How does it look?" Ellie asked, motioning towards the gash on Jacob's head. "It's still bleeding," Poppy said, her brow crinkled with worry as she dabbed at the blood. Jacob was still asleep and had yet to move so much as a muscle despite Poppy standing up and repositioning him. He'd only woken briefly the day before while Poppy tended to him, and she was worried that he was so readily sleeping without asking for food or water. Jacob was constantly hungry, always thirsty, and always craving conversation and games. Seeing him so still and so silent made Poppy suspect that something was gravely wrong. "Oh, Poppy, look at your dress!" Ellie cried, pointing at the skirt of Poppy's dress. It was covered in a muddy reddish-brown stain, dried blood from Jacob's head. She would not be able to walk through the train like that. Poppy's shoulders deflated as she looked at it. Putting aside the cloth she had been using on Jacob, she turned toward Ellie with her hands on her hips. "I have an idea." Poppy left the train compartment 10 minutes later wearing Ellie's dress. Ellie was shorter than her and slightly thinner, so the dress was far shorter and tighter than was proper, but it allowed Poppy to return to the dining car to seek out the man who had taken pity on her the day before, in the hopes that he would be willing to help them again. Poppy spotted him the moment she opened the carriage door. He looked up as she entered and smiled at her, though she could see his eyebrows raise considerably as he took in her outfit. "Hello again," Poppy said as she approached his station at the drinks cart. "Well, hello, miss. What can I do for you?" he asked, studiously avoiding looking anywhere but her face. "I'm wondering if you could help me with something. You see, my sister has stained her dress after a mishap with a plum, and we have no change of clothes with us. Do you happen to have a tablecloth or napkins you could spare?" she asked. The man looked at her in sympathy, and Poppy worried that he might send her away to find clothes elsewhere. When he opened his mouth, however, it was to say, "Follow me." Poppy followed the young man through a few carriages and into what looked to be the staff quarters. Most of the compartments were empty since the staff was working their various stations on the train, but one compartment had its door ajar and a light on. The man slid the door of this compartment open and gestured for Poppy to go in. The compartment was small, with just enough room for a bed and a small seat on which clothing and toiletries had been carelessly thrown. A young girl of around Poppy's age was sleeping soundly on the bed. She didn't wake as Poppy, and the man moved deeper into the compartment, and the man shut the door. "That's my sister, Eliza. She works in the kitchen at night. She's 16, the man said as he began rifling through the clothing on the seat, drawing out 2 dresses. They were plain and of gray wool, but looked warm, much warmer than the dress Poppy was wearing at the moment. Vincent had purposefully forced the orphans to wear thin, starched dresses or shirts and short trousers, explaining that only those children who had not sinned deserved warm, comfortable clothing. Since they were all orphans, they must have sinned. No child is left parentless unless they have sinned so greatly that our Lord and Heavenly Father has been forced to teach them a lesson, was Mrs. Julian's reasoning. Poppy didn't believe that for a minute, and thought that if anything, orphans deserved more warmth and comfort because they lacked parents. "These should fit you, and maybe you can use this," the man said, handing her a small sewing kit complete with needles and thread of various colors to alter the dress for your sister if need be. "Wait, you're giving these to me? But doesn't your sister need them?" Poppy asked. The man shook his head. "My sister and I are lucky to be employed by the train company. They feed us, shelter us, and give us enough money to buy necessities. Clara hated those dresses anyway, and was hoping to buy some new ones when we got to Little Rock in a few days. Please, take them. I hope they will keep you warm." Poppy found herself tearing up at the man's kindness, but she took the dresses just the same, along with the sewing kit, and walked behind the man as he led her back toward the passenger compartments. "Thank you so much," Poppy said as she stood beside him outside her compartment. "I don't know how I can repay you." The man shook his head. "You don't have to. I wouldn't be a very good servant of our Lord if I didn't help those in need, especially young women like you. Something tells me you're in a bit of trouble, and I want to do my bit to help you out of whatever danger might be following you." Poppy smiled at him and thanked him again. The man bowed slightly in front of her and said, "It's my pleasure, honestly," and then walked away. As Poppy opened the door, she realized he hadn't even told her his name. Chapter 8. Poppy and Ellie were considerably more comfortable in their new dresses, and Ellie's had only needed slight altering to make it wearable. Thankfully, Poppy had been tasked with mending clothes at the orphanage, and as such knew how to take in busts, shorten or lengthen dresses, and even how to sew taboo designs into the fabric where Mrs. Julian couldn't see them. Poppy used their old dresses as a pillow and blanket for Jacob, who slept on and off for the next few days. He ate a little cheese and bread and took a few sips of water, but his skin remained pale, and large, purple circles started to grow under his eyes, despite all his hours of sleep. Poppy and Ellie grew increasingly worried as they neared the stop at Little Rock, with Jacob sleeping soundly across from them. Seated on the soft bench, gazing out the window, they prayed that their little brother would survive his injury. Ellie grew ever more distraught as the days passed with no sign of improvement in his condition. She couldn't imagine losing her little brother. On the morning before the train stopped at Little Rock, Poppy was with Alan, the man who had gifted them the dresses, getting leftover breakfast rolls, when Ellie noticed Jacob's apparent improvement. His chest had been rising and falling slowly all morning, and color had returned to his cheeks. Ellie hoped it meant he would wake soon, allowing Poppy and her to help him outside into the fresh air. She would enjoy the opportunity to walk around the train station and perhaps buy some nuts with the few coins they had left. It had been so long since Jacob had taken in more than a few bites of food, and Ellie hoped that the sugary nuts might encourage his appetite. Ellie returned from the lavatory to check on Jacob, only to find him not breathing, his face ashen and his body limp. "Jacob!" Ellie cried, shaking him and lightly tapping on his cheeks. His skin was cold to the touch, and Ellie couldn't feel him breathing. After fruitless attempts to wake him, Ellie sat back on the bench, realizing that despite her and Poppy's best efforts, Jacob was dead. Only minutes later, Poppy opened the door to the compartment, carrying the bread rolls and jam that Alan had given her on her way out of the dining carriage. She was hiding the treats behind her back, hoping to surprise Ellie with the goodies, when she looked in and saw her sister's face. Tears were running down Ellie's cheeks, and her eyes were shut. She looked in terrible emotional pain, and Poppy rushed into the carriage, throwing the food on the seat next to Ellie, kneeling in front of her sister and grasping her hands. "What's wrong?" Poppy asked, squeezing Ellie's hands. "It's Jacob. He's dead," Ellie whispered. Poppy sat frozen for a few moments after Ellie spoke. "Jacob? Dead? Impossible." Yes, he had been badly wounded, but they had been taking good care of him, and he'd looked much better that morning. It was impossible that her bright, excitable little brother, the one always willing to play a game or hear a joke, was gone. It simply wasn't possible. Poppy couldn't lose another member of her family. But I don't understand. How? Why? What?" Poppy said, but she couldn't finish. Instead, she sat back, her head hitting the seat where Jacob now lay silently. Poppy's head fell into her hands, and she began to weep. Ellie followed suit, and anyone passing by their compartment would have heard the deep, racking sobs of two girls whose lives had once again been ruined by immeasurable tragedy. Poppy and Ellie remained that way for hours, with Poppy on the floor weeping and Ellie on the bench, looking silently at the lifeless form of her brother. When the sound of voices and movement could be heard in the passageways, Poppy realized they must be close to Little Rock. She had to pull herself together. She was the adult, the stand-in parent to Ellie, and she needed to take care of this situation, no matter how gruesome and macabre it was. "We need to bundle him up and bury him in Little Rock," Poppy said to Ellie, standing up and turning to her brother. She smoothed his cropped hair and began wrapping him in their recently discarded dresses. Poppy distracted herself from the sight of her dead brother with thoughts of Mason. She was only days away from meeting him and embarking on a new life, and she couldn't wait for the change of scenery. It would take her mind off everything: the escape from the orphanage, her fear that Mrs. Julian was still after her, and the sadness over Jacob's death. And hopefully, Mason wouldn't mind Ellie once he met her. Ellie was such a good girl, so quiet and diligent, and she'd make a good helper around the house and ranch. Surely once Mason saw her usefulness, he would forgive Poppy for not telling him about her. Ellie took a few minutes to collect herself before standing up to help her sister. They cleaned Jacob up as best as possible and wrapped him in their dresses so his face was shrouded. He was heavy in Poppy's arms as she lifted him from the seat and began to make her way into the passageway. The conductor called out that they were almost at Little Rock, and Ellie looked out the window to see the station platform just ahead. She couldn't face going with Poppy. Suddenly, she was exhausted. She could feel sleep trying to claim her, even as she stood tall in the train compartment. Poppy would have to bury Jacob by herself. Ellie simply couldn't face saying goodbye to another family member. It was too much. Poppy noticed her sister swaying where she stood and whispered, "You rest, Ellie. We're supposed to stop for an hour and a half, so I should have time to find a small plot of land and bury him. Rest, and I'll come back when I'm finished." "I'm so sorry, Ellie." Ellie nodded, a tear escaping as she fell back into the same seat she had been planted in for what felt like hours. She curled into herself and wept silently, falling into a fitful sleep as Poppy made her burdensome way down the train's passageway toward the doors, towards Little Rock and Jacob's final resting place. Chapter 9. Poppy was among the first passengers to alight from the train, which meant that few saw her carry the bundle of what was once her brother to the grassy area behind the train platform. A fence separated the train from the field, but it was low and easy for Poppy to climb over, even in her dress. She walked for a while, looking for holes or divots in the ground that might give her a head start on Jacob's grave. A quarter of a mile from the train station, she found a dry creek bed devoid of water. Small, smooth rocks were scattered around it, and Poppy moved these out of the way, placing Jacob in the middle of the creek bed. She took great fistfuls of grass from the surrounding area and piled them on top of Jacob until his whole body was covered. "Dear Lord, please greet my dear little brother with open arms as he ascends to heaven. He lived his life an obedient, joyful child, a devout servant to you, and a friend to all. May he rest in peace. Amen," Poppy whispered, choking on the last word as tears began to run down her face. She swallowed back her sobs as she packed a small pile of rocks at the foot of Jacob's makeshift grave. He had always loved playing with blocks, loved constructing, and she thought he would have liked the small rock structure she made for him. It was to be her final good deed for her brother, and this thought drove Poppy into momentary despair. She allowed herself a few minutes of racking sobs before she sniffed and wiped the tears from her eyes and stood. She had to be strong for Ellie. It didn't matter if she was hurting inside or if she felt like giving up and staying in this grassy field forever. She needed to walk back to the train, sit down across from her sister, and help her through the next few days of their journey, because ahead awaited a new life for both of them. A life hopefully full of love and respect, or at the very least, safety. Poppy walked back toward the train station just as the conductor was calling for all passengers to board for their continued journey to Maple Tree Station. Poppy passed Alan as she boarded, and he smiled at her, but she couldn't return his smile. She didn't know when she'd be able to smile again. Ellie was asleep when Poppy re-entered their compartment, and Poppy sat down across from her on the bench that had been Jacob's bed. She could still smell him, his sweet and powdery little boy smell, but she kept herself from crying, knowing somehow that in the coming days, Ellie would shed enough tears for them both. For the next 3 days, Ellie did not speak. She slept or stared out the window, nibbled on the bread that Poppy brought her, and dutifully drank the water Poppy handed her, but she was a ghost of her former self. Poppy let her grieve, knowing it was necessary if her sister was to ever accept her brother's death, but it hurt her heart to see Ellie so forlorn. Alan and his sister came by a few times to check on Poppy and Ellie. Poppy never explained what had happened to Jacob, but she could see from the pity in Alan's eyes that he and his sister had guessed some tragedy had befallen the little boy. Either Alan or Eliza would sit with them for an hour or two, quietly playing cards with Ellie when she was awake. Alan answered Poppy's questions about whether any of the train staff had mentioned an orphanage mistress in search of 3 runaways. "You're safe. There's been no such talk." Alan assured Poppy the day before they were due to arrive at Mapletree. "I don't know what trouble befell you before you got on this train, Poppy, but I hope that God brings you good things in Mapletree. You and Ellie deserve it." Poppy teared up at Alan's kindness. She would miss him when they left the train the next day. He and his sister had been so kind to her, Ellie and Jacob. She had known so few truly kind people since arriving at the orphanage all those years ago, but perhaps there were other people like Sister Miller and Alan in Mapletree, good, kind people with whom she could get along. Mason seemed like such a person. Poppy was becoming ever more anxious to meet her betrothed. She imagined him as a tall, thin man with dark hair and a strong jaw, but she looked forward to seeing him in the flesh. She hoped he liked her and Ellie, and that he would welcome them into his home. Poppy worried that Ellie might remain silent and depressed after their arrival at the ranch. Then again, provided Ellie worked hard, Poppy was sure Mason would not mind, and perhaps the sun and fresh air would be good for them. The orphanage was so cold and dank and dark, and Poppy was looking forward to living where she was free to walk around outdoors, dressed warmly with her sister by her side. Being different ages, she and Ellie had rarely been able to spend time together in the orphanage, and Poppy hoped that finally getting to spend quality time with her sister would help heal the myriad of wounds they had both accrued in the past years. Poppy looked out the window and saw the world rushing by. Alan had told her earlier that they were about 20 minutes out of Mapletree, and Poppy was becoming nervous. She felt jittery and stood to pace back and forth across the small, free space of the compartment. 20 minutes until she met the man she was going to spend the rest of her life with. Nervous butterflies filled Poppy's stomach. When she was little, and before her parents had died and she and her siblings had fallen into the greedy hands of Mrs. Julian and the other orphanage masters at St. Vincent's, Poppy had imagined her wedding. She'd always wanted to wear light blue, the color her mother had worn at her own wedding. Once upon a time, she'd even imagined wearing the very same dress as her mother, though now that was impossible. She had burned her mother's wedding dress shortly after her death, for fuel for the fire that had kept her and her siblings from freezing to death during the first of those cold and empty weeks. Perhaps Mason would lend Poppy the money to purchase a bolt of cloth in town to use to make a new dress. That is assuming that Mapletree had a store that sold cloth and other dressmaking accoutrements. She and Ellie would need at least one other dress besides the gray woolen ones they were currently wearing, as well as nightclothes and stockings. Poppy could already see the patterns in her mind's eye. They'd finally have warm, comfortable clothes to wear in place of those horrible, scratchy dresses they were forced into at the orphanage. Poppy looked over at her sister. Ellie was lying on the bench with her eyes open, staring off into space. She needed to get her up and prepared to depart when the train arrived at the station, and she needed to school her sister on how to behave around Mason. "Ellie? Ellie, why don't you sit up? Come, I'll help you," Poppy said as she stooped down and grasped her sister gently by the shoulders. Ellie was as floppy as a rag doll as Poppy lifted her into a sitting position. Poppy held Ellie's face in her hands for a moment, peering into her sister's eyes until they finally lifted to hers. "I know I haven't given you many details on why exactly we are headed to Texas in the first place, but it's time you know because we're nearly at our destination. I applied to be a mail-order bride, Ellie. I corresponded with a very nice man named Mason Brodie, who owns a ranch near Maple Tree, and he's going to marry me in a few weeks. We'll live on his ranch and be a family together, and you and I will finally be comfortable and safe and well-fed. Doesn't that sound wonderful? Poppy asked her sister. Ellie's brow wrinkled in confusion as she considered what Poppy had said, but then her eyes cleared and she shrugged. Whatever you think is best, Poppy, Ellie whispered. Her voice was raspy from lack of use, but Poppy still thought her sister sounded like an angel after so many days of silence. She hugged her tightly, and for a moment the girls clung to each other. Poppy was relieved that her sister had finally spoken, and Ellie was monumentally grateful that her sister had sacrificed her own future for the betterment of her and their now dead brother. The girls broke away from each other just as the conductor called that they were minutes away from Maple Tree. Ellie helped Poppy gather their meager belongings, the cloth in which Sister Miller had wrapped their food, and a Bible Eliza had given them shortly after Jacob died. Poppy led the way out of the compartment and toward the staff quarters. She needed to say goodbye to Alan and his sister and thank them for their help over these past few days. Poppy, Alan called, spotting her as he came out of the car that held the kitchen and its crew. It's nearly your stop, is it not? He asked. Poppy nodded, tears springing to her eyes at the idea of saying goodbye to the second friend she'd ever made. Alan walked toward her and took her hand in his. Don't cry, dear Poppy. Whatever awaits you once you alight from this train will be good. I'm sure of it, because you and Ellie deserve only goodness. Alan bowed and kissed Poppy's hand, and then turned to Ellie and did the same. They thanked Alan profusely, Ellie even opening her mouth to whisper words of gratitude before leaving the car and heading for an exit. Ellie took Poppy's hand as the train began to slow while entering the station. Just before they alighted, she squeezed, hoping to bring her sister some small measure of comfort to calm the nerves. Poppy was the first of the two girls to step down off the train and was so focused on not falling the few feet that separated the steps from the ground that for a moment she didn't notice the man standing before her. When she straightened herself, Poppy saw him. Mason. It had to be. She knew in her heart that this was the man she'd spent countless hours writing to, the man she'd spent the last few months imagining. It was him in the flesh, and he was more handsome than she could have ever imagined. Chapter 10. Mason was shocked at the beauty of the young woman standing before him. Poppy's caramel brown hair was pulled back into a small bun at the nape of her neck, allowing him to appreciate the full beauty of her face. Her eyes were large and heavy-lidded, the green irises shot through with flecks of gold. Her lashes were long and curled like a doll's, her nose small and rounded, and her lips pouted and just bitten pink. He had tried picturing the woman to whom he had written all those letters, but Mason had never had a particularly good imagination. Being raised in a ranching family meant that he'd learned to be practical early on and had put aside childish fancies far earlier than most boys his age. The most he'd been able to imagine about Poppy was her voice. He had imagined she would have a soft, lilting voice that would soothe Rosie when she cried out. That was, after all, his reason for sending for Poppy to join them, to care for Rosie and the ranch house, not Mason. He and Poppy would never have anything other than friendship. Poppy? Mason inquired, his voice hoarse as he stood before the woman he was preparing to marry in just a few weeks. Poppy blushed as she realized who he was. Yes, that's me. And you must be Mason. It's so nice to finally meet you, she said in the most beautiful voice Mason had ever heard. A smaller, younger girl disembarked just behind Poppy and took up position beside her. She looked a little like Poppy, although her hair was darker, her eyes lighter, and her skin wan, as though she hadn't felt the sunlight of her skin in some time. Poppy turned to the girl next to her. Mason, this is my sister, Ellie. She traveled with me from Chicago. Her voice wavered as though she was worried about Mason's reaction to her statement. And well, she should worry. This was not what Mason had signed up for when he'd proposed marriage. Poppy was the only woman he was expecting to welcome into his home. He and Rosie had dealt with enough in the last year without having an unexpected stranger moving in with them. Your sister? You did not tell me you were bringing your sister. You said nothing about a sister in any of your letters. Poppy looked shocked, as if he had slapped her. He knew he sounded harsh, but he didn't care. This was hard enough for him, finding a woman to replace his dear Elizabeth. Only now this woman, whom he was supposed to trust with his life and his child, had lied to him. He didn't like it. I'm sorry, Poppy whispered, her fear obvious. Ellie stepped closer to her sister and wrapped her arm around her. Together they stood in front of Mason, a joined force united against him. Oh well, as long as they cared for Rosie and cooked for him, Mason didn't care. Ellie was just another helping hand, and her silence meant she wouldn't be much trouble to him or anyone else. Mason didn't respond to Poppy's apology, but motioned for the two sisters to follow him. They walked through the train station and out to the dirt road where Mason's horse was waiting. I'm assuming you've never ridden a horse before? He asked the girls. Both girls shook their heads. He sighed and gave them a boost onto his filly, Mary, before also mounting. It was a tight squeeze on the horse's back, but it was only a short ride back to the ranch. Mason was eager to get home. He'd left Rosie alone, napping in her room. He, Ellie, and Poppy set off at a brisk pace, the familiar dry desert land whipping by them as Mason directed them toward their new home. Over there is where I run the cattle, Mason indicated to Poppy and Ellie as they passed the far side of the ranch. We have about 100 at the moment, but I'm hoping to buy more when I head to the market in a few weeks. Mason unsaddled his filly and led her to her stall in the barn. He only had one horse for the moment, but he was hoping to get another horse or two at the market. Poppy and Ellie, he supposed, would need a means to get around the land beside their own 2 feet. Mason was disgruntled at the idea of having to teach 2 women instead of one how to ride a horse, but he couldn't very well turn Ellie away when she'd traveled all this way with Poppy. Mason would just have to make do. If you follow me, I'll show you to where you'll be staying, Mason said, motioning to the small building a few hundred yards to the left of the horse barn. Mason had built it himself when he and Elizabeth were first married, thinking that when Elliot got too old, he could live there and be close to his grandchildren. Of course, that would never happen now, but at least the building would be put to good use. It had a large bedroom with a single bed that the girls could share, as well as a rudimentary kitchen, complete with a wood stove and a small table with 2 chairs. Seeing the house brought thoughts of Elliot and the secret Mason was keeping from him. He knew he should tell Elliot about Poppy, but he could no longer handle the man's scorn. His heart hurt enough with Elizabeth's loss. Losing the family that had taken him in after their marriage was too much to bear. Mason held the door open for Poppy and Ellie as they walked up the 3 steps that led to the porch. The door led to the kitchen, which Mason had cleaned and stocked with supplies from the local market. On the table, he'd placed Elizabeth's old vase, now filled with freshly cut daisies. He felt stupid now looking at the flowers, thinking they were a touch too far, but Poppy smiled when she saw them. Daisies, my favorite flower, she exclaimed, and Mason couldn't help the jump his heart gave at her delight. Poppy and Ellie walked through to the bedroom while Mason waited in the kitchen. He could hear the 2 muttering to each other, but he couldn't make out their words. Poppy walked back into the kitchen. Thank you so much, Mason. This house is wonderful, and thank you for the flowers. Mason grunted and said, This is where you'll stay for the foreseeable future. We are to be married in 4 weeks. I've set the date with the local priest. The wedding will be held at the church down the road. I'll make sure you have time to go to town and get whatever you might need to outfit yourself for the occasion, and Miss Ellie, too. Mason didn't miss the look of shock on Poppy's face. She must have assumed they were to be married right away, but Mason didn't want the ceremony to happen before Poppy and Rosie were properly acquainted. For her sake, as well as his, he needed to take things one step at a time. Poppy recovered and nodded, smiling at Mason as he walked out of the kitchen and back down the steps. I will be bringing meat and corn over for your dinner. You and Ellie will eat here tonight, Mason said over his shoulder as he left. Poppy stood on the porch and watched him leave, her brow furrowing at this strange man to whom she had shackled herself. Chapter 11. Was he so rude in his letters? Ellie asked Poppy later that night as they lay next to each other in bed. In a small trunk next to the bed, Poppy had found 2 white muslin nightgowns with lace detailing. She and Ellie wore them now in bed, though they were covered in a warm woolen blanket to ward off the chill that swept through the house. Poppy had always imagined Texas to be warm, but at that moment it seemed even colder than Chicago in the dead of winter. No. In his letters he was kind, welcoming, warm even. It's almost like he was a different man, Poppy whispered, her voice breaking as she spoke. Though she hadn't expected Mason to welcome her like a long-lost love, she had hoped for some measure of warmth, but the only emotion the man seemed able to show toward her was anger. He was more handsome than she could possibly have imagined, but also so much colder and crueler. She could only hope he would warm to her in time. It's my fault. You didn't tell him about me, and now he hates me, and you by connection. I should leave. I should have never come with you. If Jacob and I had stayed in the orphanage, you'd be here, happy, and Jacob would still be alive, Ellie said, turning away from her sister and beginning to sob into her pillow. No, Ellie, you know that's not true. He'll come to love you just as I do. You wait. How could he not? And you know it was time for us to leave. What happened to Jacob was tragic, and we'll both regret it until the end of our days. But it wasn't our fault. Mrs. Julian is to blame, and we're far away from her now. We're safe, Poppy said as she curled herself around her sister, quieting her sobs with gentle strokes of her hair and soothing platitudes in her ear. Poppy hoped the words she'd spoken were true. Alan had assured her that no one was asking after her or her siblings on the train, but Poppy couldn't be sure that Mrs. Julian wasn't somehow following them. What if she'd tortured the truth out of Sister Miller? What if she'd found the remnants of the letters in Sister Miller's hearth? Poppy could only pray that her friend was safe from that woman's wrath. She knew it was wrong, but she hoped that she was correct in her assumption that Mrs. Julian was dead. Poppy and Ellie slept fitfully that night, tossing and turning in the new bed with its clean sheets and warm blankets. It was so different from their beds at the orphanage. Those mattresses had been as hard as rocks, and the single blanket they were allowed did little to ward off the cold. But here in Texas, Poppy and Ellie were wrapped up warmly. Eventually, in the early hours of the morning, they fell into a deep sleep and curled around each other for warmth and comfort until dawn. The weak winter sunlight streamed in through the curtains of their bedroom, waking them on their first day in their new home. Poppy helped Ellie dress, and the girls sat down to a breakfast of bread, having given up the notion of hot coffee brewed on the stove. Mason came by while they were breakfasting to show Poppy how to light the wood stove to keep herself and her sister warm. It's quite easy, you'll find. Just takes a few sparks, and then it will last all day. I'll bring wood every week so you never run out. The wind here in the desert can be biting at night, and I don't want either of you catching cold. Poppy thanked Mason and was about to return to her breakfast when she realized he was still standing in the doorway of the house. Is there something else? She asked. Mason nodded, and without making eye contact with her, said, When you're finished your meal, walk down to the main house. Ellie, you can stay here. I have something to show you, Poppy. Poppy nodded and wished Mason a good morning before turning to her sister. Till rating percent. What could he be showing me? Where I'll cook and tend to the house. I didn't think he would want me in the main ranch house until after we were married. Oh, Ellie, I wish I knew how to decipher that man. He's so confusing. Showing us how to light the fire to keep us warm one minute and gruffly telling me what to do the next. How am I ever supposed to get to know him as a friend, let alone a husband? Ellie shook her head silently and went back to eating her bread. Poppy could feel tears pricking her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away and took a large gulp of the cool water. When she set her hand back on the table, Ellie reached across and grabbed it, squeezing Poppy's palm to let her know that no matter what, she was there for her. After finishing her breakfast and the coffee they had managed to brew, Poppy straightened her dress and hair and walked to the main house. The wind had died down and the sun was out, lending slight warmth to the day as Poppy made her way to the large ranch house. It was 3 times the size of the house she and Ellie were in, with a large wraparound porch, 4 windows facing the fields, and a second floor with its own window looking out over the homestead. Poppy wondered, as she mounted the steps to the porch, whether Mason had built this house himself. She remembered him writing to her that this ranch had only been his since he had married, but the house was so well taken care of and in such good condition that Poppy couldn't imagine that it had existed before Mason joined his wife's family. Poppy knocked on the heavy wooden front door and waited for Mason to answer. As she waited, she looked around and spotted a baby's rattle and a small doll on one of the chairs lining the porch. How odd. Did Mason have nieces and nephews who visited often? Why else would he have children's toys on his property? Poppy didn't have time to continue her contemplation because Mason flung the door open. He was dressed in dark gray wool trousers with a black vest covering a raw cotton shirt. He wore no overcoat, and Poppy could make out the muscles beneath his shirt which were straining at the fabric. He must be strong from all the ranch work. Even standing still before her, he possessed a kind of raw power and strength that both excited and terrified her. "Morning," he said gruffly as he held the door for Poppy to enter the house. Mason's house was indeed much bigger than Poppy's, and his front door led into a large sitting room complete with a chair, table, and roaring fire. A ledger was open on the chair with an inkwell pen balanced on top of it. Poppy must have caught him in the middle of doing accounts of some sort. "Let me give you a tour of the house," Mason said, ushering Poppy further into the room so that he could close the door behind her. Mason walked through the sitting room and into the kitchen. The table was just off the living room and could seat at least 6. A vase full of flowers had been placed in the middle of the table, and Poppy smiled at them, thinking that perhaps Mason was a man who appreciated the touch of home comforts. Perhaps he had even gathered those flowers himself. Beyond the table were the cooking facilities, complete with a large coal-burning stove, pegs on the walls holding a variety of pots and pans, and a small grouping of shelves rising from floor level that held what looked like decorative glasses, plates, and vases. "My wife's," Mason said, pointing to the shelves. Poppy spotted beautifully painted teacups and glass tumblers before Mason directed her toward the stove. "This is where you'll be cooking. Do you know how to cook?" Mason asked. Poppy nodded. "Helping to prepare the meals was one of my duties at the orphanage. I can cook stews, soups, and porridge," Poppy said. She realized she had no real idea whether the food in Texas was different from that in Chicago. She assumed that working and living on a cattle ranch meant easy access to fresh meat and possibly fresh greens and vegetables from a kitchen garden. But beyond that, she had no idea what Mason's meals might entail. "I don't quite know about the typical meals you would be accustomed to down here, though, I'm afraid," Poppy added, uncertainty in her tone. "I don't really know anything about Texas other than where it is on a map." Mason turned from fiddling with a knob on the stove and looked at her with something resembling pity. "Meat stews and soups, mostly. I source most of the meat myself, and there's a market in town once a week. I'll take you there and show you what I like to eat." Poppy nodded, grateful that he was willing to help her. "That sounds nice." "Thank you, Mason," she said. It was the first time he had heard her speak his name out loud, and he looked shocked at the sound, as if he hadn't heard his name spoken in a very long time. "Let me show you the main bedroom," Mason said, gesturing for Poppy to follow him to the far side of the house. Poppy was confused as to why she would need to see the bedroom. Surely, he didn't plan on her sleeping there until they were well acquainted and married? It was then that Poppy saw the crib and the sweet little cherubic face peeking out from beneath its lace covering. Words that sounded very much like "Dada" came from the crib in a high, girlish voice. Could that be a baby? Mason walked to the crib and flipped the lace covering up. He gathered the baby girl in his arms and scooped her up to rest on his chest. "Poppy, meet Rosie." "Rosie," Mason said, turning so his daughter could see Poppy. Meet Poppy, your new mama. You, you have a child? Poppy whispered. She was shocked. She hadn't expected to take on the role of a new mother in addition to a wife when she had agreed to marry Mason all those weeks ago. After all, Poppy was only 18 years old. She was just barely out of childhood herself. And while she had taken care of the other children at the orphanage like they were her own siblings, that didn't mean she was remotely capable of handling a baby. Mason wouldn't meet her eyes, instead choosing to focus on his daughters, as he explained. Elizabeth and I had a baby. That's actually how Elizabeth died, in childbirth. Rosie has been my guiding light this past year, but I can't take care of her and the ranch all by myself. That is why I applied for a wife. I needed someone to help me tend to Rosie and the household duties so I could focus on the cattle. And she's no trouble, really. Hardly cries, sleeps through the night, eats her meals, and doesn't fuss. She's the easiest baby in the world. Rosie squealed as Mason finished, giving her daddy a gap-toothed smile. Mason readjusted his hold on her and finally looked up to meet Poppy's eyes. She's easy to love, Poppy, and she needs a woman's love. I can't raise her on my own. Please help me. I need some time to think. I'll come visit me later at the house. I'll have an answer for you then, Poppy said, and walked out of the house, leaving Mason and Rosie to watch her depart. Poppy did not head directly back to the cottage she shared with Ellie. She walked around the fields for a while, exploring the grounds and taking the time to arrange her thoughts. Mason had lied to her. He wanted her to be not just a wife, but a mother. And while Rosie was the sweetest-looking baby Poppy had ever seen, she wasn't sure she was ready to take this on. So much had happened these past few weeks, and she had hardly had the time to process any of it. Poppy walked around the horse barn and back towards her cottage, realizing that she couldn't abandon Mason and Rosie because they were her and Ellie's only chance at safety. They couldn't return to Chicago and risk the wrath of Mrs. Julian if she had indeed survived Poppy's attack, and they had nowhere else to go. Poppy would just have to make the best of the situation in which she had found herself. She would care for Rosie and learn to like Mason. And in time, they would be married, and maybe, eventually, the four of them would be a family. 12. Rosie Posey, how are we this morning? How are we, my precious girl? Poppy sang as she helped Rosie from the crib and danced with her into the kitchen. Ellie was at the stove stirring the corn porridge they would have for lunch. Though Ellie seemed livelier than she had upon first setting foot in Mapletree, Poppy was still worried about her. Her face was wan, and she seemed to be losing weight. Her dress hanging from her, and her collarbone even more pronounced than it had been at the orphanage. Poppy wished that Ellie would talk about Jacob and her feelings, but she hadn't mentioned their brother since their first night on the ranch. Poppy could only hope that time would heal Ellie's wounds. Spending her days cooking and cleaning and looking after Rosie had helped Poppy avoid thinking about Jacob and, by extension, Mrs. Julian. The nights, however, were filled with nightmares and the terror of Mrs. Julian finding Ellie at the ranch and dragging her back to Chicago. Poppy couldn't let that happen. She knew she should tell Mason that her sister was in danger, but she was afraid to. Mason had been so angry at her when he realized that Poppy had lied to him about Ellie. Although he had done the same about Rosie, he didn't seem likely to forgive Poppy if it came to pass that she had kept another truth from him. Perhaps in time the nightmares would fade. Mrs. Julian could, after all, only expend so much time and energy in search of Ellie before she gave up and found another orphan to take her place. Poppy could only hope. Why was she so much less certain now that Mrs. Julian had not died on the night they escaped from the orphanage? Throughout the train journey, she had never doubted that the evil woman was dead. Why had she then resurrected her in her mind, thoughts, and night terrors now that she and Ellie were safely in Texas? Rosie giggled in Poppy's arms, and her anxious thoughts fell away as she looked at the beautiful girl in her arms. Rosie really was a miracle. She was the happiest baby Poppy had ever had the pleasure to know, constantly smiling, laughing, and giggling. She loved games and singing and reveled in being read to. Poppy often read to her from the Bible she had found on one of the shelves in the main room. Rosie seemed to like the Book of Mark best, though Poppy always read a few Psalms to her as well, since they were her personal favorites. "Rosie, my posy, let's go see what Ellie is up to," Poppy sang as she carried the girl into the kitchen. "How's the porridge?" Poppy asked, to which Ellie simply nodded. Cornmeal, the main ingredient in the porridge, was new to the girls, but Mason had told them it was a staple here in the Southwest. It was hearty and easy to cook, and keeps you full and strong long into the day, according to Mason. He said it was his favorite lunch on days when he had ranch work to handle. The girls had taken to making it for him as a thank you for taking them in. Ellie didn't seem to like it, barely ever finishing more than half her bowl, but Poppy loved it. She could feel herself growing stronger, gaining weight, and finally filling into the womanly figure she had known was hiding in her all along. She no longer felt the cold rattle in her bones at night, and her seat bones no longer dug into the wooden seat of the chairs in her kitchen. For the first time in nearly 5 years, she was properly fed. Long before Poppy was planning the escape from the orphanage, her Uncle David was looking for them. David crossed the Atlantic in hopes of somehow finding his brother's children. But when he landed in Chicago, no one in the Brown family's old tenement building had any idea what had happened to the children of Edward and Sarah. "I came one day to check on them, and they were gone," Maria Cotorino told David when he knocked on her door. "They were the sweetest children. I hope they were able to find shelter after the landlord evicted them." David spent days visiting the local shelters, workhouses, and orphanages before finally landing on St. Vincent's doorstep. "The Brown children? Yes, I know of them," a small, withered old woman told him. She introduced herself as Mrs. Julian, looked hard and bitter, and David sincerely hoped that this was not the person who had taken his nieces and nephew into her care. "No one knows what happened to them, I'm afraid," Mrs. Julian said, scowling as she leaned over her desk. "They simply vanished one day. Poor dears. They were always so eager to explore. We think the cold winter might have claimed them. It's quite common, you know, losing an orphan or two in the winter in that way." David balked at the idea of the children freezing to death, and he left Mrs. Julian's office feeling even more hopeless. But as he was nearing the entrance to the orphanage, he heard someone whisper out to him to his right. David turned and found the kind, pale face of a nun staring back at him from behind a stone pillar. David approached her, and she motioned for him to follow her into the main chapel. The nun introduced herself as Sister Miller and briefly told David what had become of the Brown children. They escaped out west to a place they referred to as Maple Tree. It was a few days' train journey from here, and all 3 children left 2 weeks ago in the middle of the night to walk to the station where they had the fare to pay for their passage. David breathed a visible sigh of relief, knowing that the children had at the very least escaped what, from the brief time he had spent in it, felt like a truly terrible place in which to exist as a child. The orphanage was cold and damp, and every child he passed looked forlorn and far too thin. It did not go unnoticed either, how every one of the children he did happen upon during his brief time inside the institution kept their eyes downcast. What would make a child take such measures as to be certain never to venture to so much as dare to make eye contact with him? Knowing his family had escaped such a place to somewhere warmer in the Southwest filled him with joy. That is until Sister Miller explained what had befallen Jacob. "That woman beat my nephew?" David yelled in consternation, but Sister Miller urged him to be quiet. "I am sure that Poppy and Ellie took good care of him. Sadly, we are used to treating wounds here at St. Vincent's, sir. Jacob is not the first child to be harmed at the hands of Mrs. Julian, nor will he be the last. I fear." "You must report that woman to the authorities," David whispered urgently. Sister Miller nodded. "I have. I walked to the police station the very day following Jacob's mistreatment while on my way to the market and reported to the authorities all that had happened, but they have yet to make an appearance here to question her. I can only surmise that they do not consider an old woman beating a parentless child to be a crime worth pursuing." David shook his head. feeling sad for all the children who had resigned their fate to the orphanage. At least they had a kind woman such as Sister Miller looking out for them. "Are you going to go find Poppy, Ellie, and Jacob?" Sister Miller asked as she saw David out of the chapel and onto the street. David nodded. "I must. They're all the family I have in this world. I have to know that they're safe and well looked after. I won't rest until I do find them." Yang. "I'll collect my belongings from the hotel and head directly to the train station without further delay to purchase the next available ticket to Mapletree, and I will write to you once I know that they are safe." "Oh, God bless you, sir," Sister Miller blurted with tears sparkling in her eyes at the idea of Poppy and her siblings finally reuniting with this gentleman and knowing the rewards of being a family again. It had been just the three of them for so long. "Make sure you ease Poppy's mind about Mrs. Julian. I know she'll be worrying that Mrs. Julian is still looking for them, but please tell her not to fret. Mrs. Julian has found replacements for Ellie and Jacob, and other than being upset that the kitchen was bloody and that she was knocked out cold, Mrs. Julian has forgotten the incident. She won't pursue the Brown children, I can assure you of that." David took Sister Miller's hand in his and shook it, saying, "Thank you, sister, and God bless you," before putting his hat back on and setting off along the snow-covered Chicago streets. Chapter 13, $200. It's yours as soon as you can sell that ranch. "I swear it," Elliot Turner told the solicitor seated at his kitchen table. He hadn't given up on his plan to sell the ranch out from under Mason. If anything, Elliot's ire toward Mason had only grown stronger over these last few weeks. The man seemed tireless, constantly tending to the cattle or the ranch or his child. He seemed to have boundless energy, and it served only to make Elliot feel lazier and all the more useless. "I can have it done in a matter of weeks, Mr. Turner," the solicitor assured Elliot before gulping down the glass of whiskey before him. He stood and collected his hat and coat from the stand by the front door. "Just make sure you do. That boy needs to suffer. He deserves it," Elliot shouted as the door banged shut behind the solicitor. Elliot remained at the table for another hour, slowly gulping down the whiskey in the bottle before him. Alcohol had become his constant companion since Elizabeth's death, and over the last few weeks, he had been sober for less than an hour each day. Elliot paid one of Mason's newer ranch hands to buy him crates of whiskey, which he secreted to Elliot in the cart filled with Mason's provisions. Yesterday, when the ranch hand delivered the whiskey, Elliot noticed more food than usual in the cart. Bags of ground corn, sugar, wheat, and even jars of expensive jam filled the cart. Elliot was shocked to see perfumed bath soaps, too. Now, why would Mason be buying perfumed soaps, sugar, and jam for himself? Elliot happened to know for a fact that Mason hated sugar, having absolutely no sign of a sweet tooth. He never ate the Johnny cakes covered in syrup that Elizabeth used to make for them, saying he preferred corn porridge. Elliot also knew that no self-respecting man bought ladies' soap unless it was for the woman in his life. But Rosie was the only girl in Mason's life, wasn't she? Elliot sucked the last drop from the bottle and decided that he had to find out just what was going on in that house of Mason's. Something was fishy, and Elliot was going to find out what that might be. Elliot was stumbling toward the large ranch house when a young girl appeared from inside and walked out onto the porch. She wore a cornflower blue dress with a flower in her hair, and the wind carried a scent off her that Elliot suspected was from the soap he had seen in the cart. In her arms, she held baby Rosie, her eyes closed in sleep. "Oh, Rosie Posey, what a sleepy girl you are today," the girl called in a strange accent. Just who was this? Elliot thought to himself. And who might you be? Elliot called as he reached the bottom of the stairs. Poppy looked up in surprise from staring down into little Rosie's face. Her brow crinkled as she took in Elliot's wrinkled clothing, his wild hair, and the stench that was permeating from him. I'm Poppy Brown. Pleased to meet you, sir. And you are?" Poppy asked in a polite tone. "I am Elliot Turner, and I own this land. What might you be doing on my porch?" he asked. Before Poppy had time to respond, the door behind her opened, and out walked Mason. "Poppy, go inside," Mason demanded, and Poppy followed his orders without question, rushing through the door as Mason held it open for her. Mason turned to Elliot and straightened himself, folding his arms across his chest, his brow stern and his lips in a flat, unamused line. "That's Poppy, my future wife." Mason had thought he'd seen Elliot angry before, and assumed that he had seen the man as mad as he could get after the fit he threw when he found out about Elizabeth's passing. But Mason realized that was nothing in comparison to the swirl of anger surrounding Elliot as he stood before him now.
"What?"
Elliot screamed, charging up the porch steps and shoving Mason against the wall with his forearm. Elliot held Mason by the neck, but instead of showing any indication of fear, Mason's eyes held his in a calm, even stare. "Elliot, the only way we're going to solve this is by talking, and it's getting a little hard to do that with your arm at my throat," Mason pointed out evenly. Elliot was, however, past the point of rationality. He swung at Mason, who caught Elliot's fist in his and turned. The old man howled in pain and released Mason, allowing the younger man to step back and put some distance between them. "Elliot, that is Poppy Brown. She's 18 years old, and she's from Chicago. We're getting married in 3 weeks. We met through an advertisement in the newspaper. She's my mail-order bride." "Your mail-order what?" Elliot said, still bent over as he examined the damage Mason had inflicted on his wrist. "My mail-order bride. You and I both know I can't raise Rosie by myself, especially if you're not willing to so much as visit the babe. I need someone to help me around the ranch house, someone to raise Rosie and cook so that I am freed up to do the important work like keeping track of the cattle and managing the ranch hands. It makes sense, Elliot. It makes good business sense, and it will benefit the ranch. Isn't that what's most important to you?" While Mason was being logical and thinking rationally, Elliot reacted entirely on emotion, devoid of any level-headedness whatsoever. He stood up and approached Mason until the two men were standing chest to chest, and then he whispered menacingly, "Boy, you're going to regret this as much as I regret letting my Elizabeth take that first dance with you. Mark my words, Mason. You will regret this." Mason watched as Elliot turned and stumbled down the steps, tripping on the last one and almost falling to the ground. Mason moved to help Elliot, but the older man righted himself and stumbled back to his home. Mason only hoped that Elliot's threats were as a result of whiskey. He hoped the old man would wake up the next day regretting his words, because, like it or not, Mason was marrying the woman currently busy in the kitchen preparing his supper. He'd known he would marry her after that first letter she wrote to him, and nothing Elliot could say would change that. Poppy and Ellie were his family now. They were the family he and Rosie had been longing for, and Mason wasn't going to let Elliot Turner and his anger ruin that. Chapter 14. Mason tried to put his altercation with Elliot Turner out of his mind over the ensuing weeks. He had a ranch to tend to, as well as a new family and an upcoming wedding. The market was also drawing near, and Mason meant to sell his cattle there, which meant that he was spending even less time in the ranch house than normal. A new ranch hand had disappeared, so he was helping the others to organize the cattle into lots for sale. With the market so close, the cattle feeding also needed to be closely monitored to make sure that they were in peak condition for viewing and sale. Mason spent long hours in the winter sun, which was harsh despite the season. He had to fit more work into fewer daylight hours as they neared the end of the year, and Mason often dragged himself to bed at night, completely exhausted. Poppy was therefore a godsend, making his meals, cleaning the house, and looking after Rosie, allowing Mason the freedom to focus on his livestock. Coming home to a cooked meal, often complete with freshly baked cornbread, made him soften toward the girl. She was an excellent cook, and her presence on the ranch made life a little brighter and a little more welcoming. Although Mason had always looked forward to leaving his cattle after a full day to spend time with Rosie, he had really looked forward to going home over the past weeks since Poppy's arrival. The house that had seemed so empty after Elizabeth's passing now seemed vibrant and full of life again. Mason could also not help but notice how well Poppy and Rosie got along. Rosie was generally a happy baby who rarely cried or made a fuss, but she had never laughed or squealed much around Mason. Mason had never been around children before he was blessed with Rosie, and he had always assumed he'd learn about fatherhood and what it took to raise a child from his beloved Elizabeth. When she died, he lost not only his partner and the love of his life, but also the only person who could show him how to be a father. He had tried his best with Rosie, but he knew he fell short when it came to playing with her. Watching Poppy make his baby girl laugh and squeal warmed his heart. Poppy was naturally maternal and truly seemed to love his daughter, and this in turn made Mason think that maybe, someday, he might feel that way toward Poppy. "He really is a nice man, Ellie," Poppy told her sister one night a fortnight after their arrival in Mapletree. She had been sorely disappointed in Mason's gruff and abrasive manner at first, but she was warming to the man. He was strong and silent, but also clearly cared about his daughter, his workers, and his ranch. He was industrious and diligent and keen to provide for his family, which, Poppy supposed, now included herself and Ellie. Poppy couldn't help but notice that Mason was really handsome. Working outside had tanned his skin to a deep toffee color, which was offset by the natural black of his hair. Although he shaved every morning, by day's end he always had coarse stubble on his face, which made him look rugged and accentuated the line of his jaw. Poppy had caught herself staring at him more than once of late, and she was slowly beginning to realize that not only did she respect Mason, but she was falling in love with him. Poppy had never been in love, but she had heard about it in whispers at the orphanage, enough to know that the jump in her heart whenever she saw Mason and the butterflies in her stomach that erupted whenever he drew near her were telltale signs that she was falling for the man. She could only hope and pray that someday he would feel the same about her. But as excited as Poppy was about the prospect of falling in love and having that love returned by her soon-to-be husband, Poppy was also worried about her sister. Ellie had continued to be mostly mute and withdrawn, her skin pale and her clothes hanging off her. Poppy had hoped that finally having access to their own food would help them to both gain the weight they needed to stay warm for winter. While Poppy could feel herself rounding out, Ellie seemed to be shrinking. She picked at her plate of food each day and night, pushing the meat stews and soup around her bowl without ever lifting the spoon to her mouth. She tossed and turned in the night beside Poppy, often crying out for Jacob and sobbing in her sleep. Poppy didn't know what to do. She prayed to God that her sister would heal and that their new home would allow her to forget the horrors of their past, but Ellie seemed unable to mend. Poppy thought spending time outside might do her sister good. One sunny Thursday morning, while Mason was taking a lunch break, Poppy suggested that she and Ellie go for a walk. "Mason, would you mind watching Rosie while Ellie and I explore the ranch on foot?" Mason nodded and gave Poppy a rare smile, causing a spark to ignite in her chest. His smiles were infrequent, but they were the most beguiling she had ever seen. Poppy took Ellie's arm in hers and led her out of the house and down the ranch house steps. "It's such a beautiful day, isn't it? The perfect temperature. It's so much warmer here than in Chicago," Poppy prattled as she and Ellie walked to the right of the house toward the fields of cattle grazing. Ellie muttered, in response, but said no more to Poppy. Poppy frowned, but persevered. She would get her sister to talk if it took all morning and multiple circles of the ranch land. She had to know what Ellie was thinking. Poppy allowed them to walk in silence for a few minutes before trying again. "Ellie, will you tell me what's wrong? You haven't seemed yourself since we arrived here in Mapletree. I know you must be mourning Jacob, as am I, but you don't look yourself. You're barely eating, not speaking, and you toss and turn all night. Won't you confide in me?" Ellie stopped walking and unlaced her arm from Poppy's. She turned to her sister with tears in her eyes. Poppy immediately stepped forward and wrapped her sister in her arms, hugging her close. Rather than comforting Ellie, though, the hug seemed to upset her further. She began sobbing in Poppy's arms. It's all too much," she whispered in between sobs. She clung tighter to Poppy, who stepped back to lead Ellie toward a small wooden bench tucked against one of the slats in the fence. "Oh, Ellie, I'm so sorry. This is such a change for us, isn't it? We've gone from a terrible life at that orphanage to relative comfort, but we've lost Jacob along the way. I am so sorry if you've felt that I have been pushing you to heal before you're ready. I just want you to be happy, Poppy said, as she placed an arm around Ellie's shoulders and hugged her sister against her. Ellie nodded and rested her head on Poppy's, and they remained so for an hour, watching the cattle graze and leaning against each other for strength. Poppy realized that there was no timeline for grief. One day Ellie would be able to live with the trauma of their past, but for right now in her own beautiful head, she was still reliving it, and Poppy had to let her. Eventually, the girls stood up and began to make their way back to the ranch house. Ellie walked up the steps, whispering to Poppy that she was going to take a nap. Poppy nodded but remained outside, needing more time alone. She headed for the horse barn, intending to spend some time brushing Mason's filly. Mary was such a sweet and gentle horse and loved attention. Poppy had seen horses in Chicago, pulling carts and ferrying policemen from one street to the next. But until she arrived in Mapletree, she had never actually touched one. She found Mary's hair smooth as silk and her mane soft to the touch. Poppy always felt calmer when she was around Mary. She was just bending down to retrieve the brush from where she had left it on the floor of Mary's stall when she heard a noise behind her. Straightening herself, Poppy turned to see a strange man walking toward her. The man was stumbling and was obviously drunk. His hair was matted and unwashed. He was dressed smartly, though, in clothes similar to Mason's. Realization washed over Poppy when she recognized him as the man she had seen at the house before. The man Mason had come out to speak to after he had instructed Poppy to take Rosie inside. He had to be Elliot Turner, Elizabeth's father. Mason had only spoken of him to tell the girls to avoid the man at all costs. He's a drunk, and a mean one at that. I don't want either of you interacting with him. It won't bring any of us any good, Mason had told Poppy and Ellie the night they had arrived in Mapletree. Fear crept up Poppy's spine as she realized that Elliot Turner was blocking her only exit from the barn. The other door was shut and padlocked. Poppy didn't know how to get away from the drunk, terrifying man who was slowly making his way toward her. "You little harlot!" Elliot yelled as he came to a standstill in front of Poppy. Poppy was clinging to Mary, who was neighing and stamping her hooves in agitation. Perhaps she was also afraid of Elliot. "You think you can replace my daughter? You're a poor, impoverished little chit if you think you can hold a candle to my Elizabeth. How dare you?" Elliot yelled, spittle flying from his mouth as he yelled. "How dare you try and take her place? You ain't nothing compared to her. You hear me, you whore? Nothing." Elliot's hand shot out towards Poppy's breast so fast that she didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. The man had stepped close enough to her for her to smell the harsh tang of alcohol on his breath. Elliot's other hand fastened itself on Poppy's midsection and moved toward her hip, trying to draw her closer to him. Poppy kicked out at Elliot, her boot connecting with his shin. He cried out in pain and retreated a step, giving Poppy enough time to twist out of his grasp and run into an empty horse stall. She searched frantically for a weapon of sorts, a brush, a bucket, anything. But before she knew it, Elliot was behind her, grabbing her by the braid and yanking her against him. Just as Elliot moved his hand back to Poppy's dress and began gathering her skirts, Poppy heard footsteps behind them. She heard a loud clang, and then Elliot was falling away from her, releasing her from his grip. Poppy stumbled forward and turned to find Mason with a large shovel in his hands, looking down at Elliot Turner, who was now lying unconscious on the barn floor. "How dare you? How dare you touch her?" he screamed, kicking at Elliot before turning to Poppy. "Poppy, are you hurt? Did he hurt you?" Mason asked, throwing the shovel to the side and reaching out to Poppy. He reached out as if to touch her, but Poppy flinched and Mason dropped his hand to his side. "Are you all right?" he whispered, peering at her. Poppy nodded, but the truth was that she wasn't all right. She was shaken and scared and very much wanted to go to her dark bedroom and lie down. Mason must have sensed this because he took another look at Elliot, making sure he was still knocked out, and then he led Poppy to her cottage. He opened the door for her and lit a fire in the grate of her room to ensure that she would be comfortable. And then he left her, although it pained him to do so. He wanted to comfort her, to hug her and hold her, and tell her that he would never let anyone hurt her again. Mason watched from the doorway instead as Poppy crawled into bed, and then he shut the door and left her cottage, intent on revenge. Chapter 15. By the time Mason had returned to the horse barn, Elliot Turner was awake and sitting up against a stall door. He was holding his head in one hand, but looked up when he heard Mason's footsteps. "You bastard! How dare you harm her?" Mason yelled as he entered the barn. He rushed at Elliot, who scampered away on all fours toward the far side of the barn. When he was seated a safe distance from Mason, he spoke, but it was not the speech of a penitent man who realized his wrongdoing. It was the speech of a bitter old man who thought he could do no wrong. "That little harlot deserved everything she got and more," Elliot said, sneering at Mason. "You two, the baby, and that stupid sister of hers, deserve what fate is about to bring you." "And what exactly is that?" Mason spat back. Elliot looked him in the eyes, and fear began to crawl up Mason's spine. He knew Elliot Turner well enough to know that when the man affixed his eyes on yours, whatever came out of his mouth next was not going to be palatable. "I'm selling this ranch, boy. I'm selling it for a pretty penny, and you and that rotten little makeshift family of yours are going to be out of a house begging for your supper." "You can't do that. I know how you feel about me, Elliot. But what about Rosie? She's your flesh and blood, Elizabeth's flesh and blood," Mason yelled, advancing on Elliot. But Elliot didn't retreat. He held his ground, looking at Mason with a devilish smile on his face. "Oh yes, I can, boy. I own this ranch, in case you forgot, which means I can sell it whenever I darn well please. You've outstayed your welcome, I'm afraid. Come next week, this ranch will be someone else's problem, as will you, and I will be far, far away, counting my riches. I don't give a hoot about that stupid little baby of yours. She killed my Elizabeth, so she's no family of mine." Mason seethed with anger. Did Elliot really hate him so much that he would render him homeless? Mason had worked so hard to make the ranch a profitable venture. He couldn't believe that all that hard work would be for nothing, and that in a few weeks he and his new family would be homeless and penniless. He wouldn't let it happen. He wouldn't let Elliot win. He couldn't, now that he had not only Rosie to look after, but Poppy and Ellie as well. "Elliot, please be reasonable. We need to mend this rift between us, for both our sakes." Elliot scoffed from where he remained seated a distance from Mason. "The time for that has long since passed, boy. Ain't nothing you can do about it now. In a week that ranch won't be yours anymore. Pack your things and prepare to get off my land and take those harlots and that insufferable little babe with you." With that, Elliot began to rise, using the door of the horse stall to steady himself. He limped past Mason, sober but still slow thanks to the blow Mason had dealt to his head earlier. Mason watched him go and had to resist the urge to crumple to the floor. For the second time in his life, he felt truly hopeless. The first time had been after Elizabeth's death when he'd looked at his deceased wife's peaceful face, their newly born daughter in his arms. While that had been truly painful, in some ways this was worse. At least when Elizabeth died, Mason still had his home, his livelihood. Now he would have neither. What was he to do? Chapter 16. Mason trudged back to the ranch house with heavy feet. As he rounded the steps to the porch, he heard Poppy singing to Rosie. Mason loved hearing Poppy sing, especially to his daughter. Her voice was the sweetest thing he'd ever heard, and seeing Rosie's reaction never failed to warm his heart. Even now, as Mason walked up the stairs knowing he would have to confess to Poppy about their lot for the future, he couldn't help the smile that spread across his face as he heard Rosie giggling at Poppy's song. "Mason," Poppy said as he entered. She handed Rosie off to Ellie, who was sitting in the rocking chair by the stove, picking at a bowl of stew. "Thank you so much for saving me from Elliot. I shudder to think what would have happened if you hadn't been there," she said, gratitude showing along with something undiscernible in her eyes. If Mason wasn't mistaken, it looked quite a lot like love. Did Poppy really love him? He had grown so fond of her over the weeks, and in the quiet, still moments of the night before he nodded off to sleep, he thought he might be journeying toward those very same feelings. but seeing them in Poppy's eyes made his heart swell. "It's no trouble. I won't let him hurt you or Ellie or Rosie. I'm so sorry he cornered you." "Are you all right?" he asked, peering at Poppy. "I'm fine. A bit shaken up, but fine. How are you? Did he hurt you? I wish you hadn't gone back out there. Elliot scares me so. How can he be so cruel when you're his family?" Mason grunted in response and pulled Poppy aside and into his bedroom. He saw the look of surprise on Poppy's face as he closed the bedroom door behind them, but he needed privacy if he was going to explain this to his future wife. Mason told Poppy what Elliot had said about selling the ranch and how it would happen the next week, just before they were to be married. "I would buy him out if I could, but I just don't have the money. I've put almost everything I have into the ranch, into getting new cattle and new ranch hands, and even if I sell everything at the market in 2 weeks, it will be too late. I'm so sorry, Poppy. I don't know what we're going to do." Poppy stepped closer to Mason and placed a hand on his cheek. "Don't trouble yourself. We will manage. We will find a way. I have faith, and you should too." Mason looked down at the serene, beatific face of Poppy and realized that it was in fact love that he saw in her eyes, and that love was reflected in his own. He couldn't believe he had been so cruel, so harsh to her during her first week in Mapletree, when Poppy was the kindest, warmest, and the most understanding woman he had ever met. He would always have a place in his heart for Elizabeth, but for the first time, Mason felt that his heart could open up to another woman, to Poppy. Poppy's hand slid from Mason's cheek to the space right over his heart where it was covered by his linen shirt and leather vest, and Mason silently placed his palm on her hand. For a moment, they stood together, feeling his heart beat against their palms, and a silent oath passed between them. An oath of love, friendship, and trust. "Thank you for protecting me, for taking me and Ellie in and giving us a safe home and a family. We haven't had one in so long, you see," Poppy whispered, and a tear escaped her eye. Mason lifted her hand to his mouth and placed a gentle kiss on her palm, and then they exited his room together, hand in hand, to rejoin the rest of their makeshift family. Chapter 17. The next few mornings saw Poppy taking long walks with Mason around the ranch and surrounding area. Mason showed Poppy where he had planned to one day expand the fencing to accommodate more cattle, and he showed her Elizabeth's grave, which was near the horse barn out back, near a large batch of wild sunflowers. Poppy would pick bunches of the flowers every morning to place on the grave, whispering to Elizabeth that she hoped she had her blessing to enter into the Brodie family. Mason accompanied her to the grave on this occasion, but stood back, allowing Poppy and Elizabeth to get to know each other, as it were. He liked to think they would have been friends in life. He liked to think that Elizabeth would be happy that he had found such a wonderful new mother for Rosie. On these walks, Poppy also finally confessed to Mason all the trauma of her past. Her secrets had been eating away at her, and finally confessing them to her betrothed lifted the heavy weight from her shoulders that had been there from the moment her feet touched the ground in Mapletree. She told him about her parents dying and about Mrs. Julian's terrible treatment of her and her siblings. She teared up when she remembered Sister Miller and their close friendship, the only friend other than her siblings that Poppy had ever had. When she said this, Mason took her hand and paused, stopping their progression around the ranch. Mason turned to face her, blocking the sun from her eyes as he did so. He looked at her with compassion. "I will be your friend if you'll have me, dear Poppy," he whispered. Poppy nodded, happier than she could have ever imagined to be marrying a man so handsome and kind. The next morning, Poppy also told Mason about Jacob's death. She had rehearsed the story dozens of times in her head, hoping to find a version that didn't make her seem like the villain. When the time came to tell Mason, however, the whole ugly truth came pouring out. About how she and Ellie were about to walk off when Mrs. Julian caught Jacob, how the woman hit her brother over the head, instantly knocking him out. And worse, how she had hit Mrs. Julian in retaliation and out of anger for harming her brother. Tears of frustration and anger ran down Poppy's cheeks as she told Mason. "Some nights I still wake up from a nightmare that she's found us all the way out here. She was so terrible, Mason, so cruel, to hit Jacob, to harm my beautiful, sweet brother. And here Poppy's voice cracked, remembering the creek bed where she had laid Jacob's body to rest. How dare she call herself a Christian? No God-loving creature would be so cruel, especially to such a sweet boy. She never cared about us, any of us. She ran that orphanage out of pure spite, telling us it was our fault we were parentless. But it wasn't true. Oh, Mason. Poppy dissolved into sobs, growing weak on her feet. Mason stepped forward and wrapped Poppy in his arms as she cried for the loss of her brother, the loss of her parents, and the loss of her innocence at the hands of St. Vincent's and its terrible band of administrators and caregivers. When Poppy's tears had dried, Mason stepped away and took her hands in his. No one will ever harm you again, Poppy, not Elliot, not Mrs. Julian. And if that terrible woman comes to get you, I will protect you. Nothing bad will ever happen to you under my watch. You are safe with me. And what you did to that woman was nothing less than what she deserved, he said, and Poppy believed him. Mason was her handsome, strong protector, and she was glad to be marrying him. Poppy finally released her fear that Mrs. Julian was still after her, as well as her guilt over harming the woman. She let those negative emotions be carried off by the strong gust of wind that blew her hair and lifted her skirts as she and Mason made their way back to the house for lunch. Ellie had cooked the meat stew that Mason liked so much, but when he thanked her, she only ducked her head in response. Since arriving at Maple Tree weeks ago, Ellie hadn't spoken a single word to the man, and Mason wanted to know why. Ellie was Poppy's family, and therefore part of his, and he needed to know what to do to make the girl feel at ease around him. He didn't want her to stay silent for the rest of her life. It wasn't good, and it wasn't healthy. He knew something must have caused it, and he needed to find out what that could be. While on a walk later that week, Mason finally asked Poppy the reason behind Ellie's silence. He told her that had tried his best to get to know her sister, but he didn't want to make her uncomfortable with constant questions and attempts at conversation. The few times he had tried to start a conversation with her, Ellie only seemed to shrink even further into herself. Only Poppy seemed to be able to get her to speak, and even then, only in snippets and whispers. Why was that? He asked. She's sad because of Jacob, Poppy said in answer to his questions. After he died, she stopped speaking. They were closer in age than I was to either of them, and often grouped for chores at the orphanage. So they spent more time together than I did with them because I was with the older orphans. Jacob was Ellie's best friend, and losing him killed something in her. She used to be so talkative, so chatty, and excited about life. But since his death, since I buried him, she's been so quiet. She is getting better. I think being out here has done her a world of good. But I believe it will take some time before she is back to herself. I don't rightly know how long it will be until she's talking and excited about life again. I hope it will be soon, but I don't want to pressure her. We've all been through so much. You buried Jacob? Mason asked, shocked that Poppy had not only lost her brother, but had performed his burial too. She had been through so much in her short life. It grieved him to hear the trauma she had endured. Poppy nodded. Yes, but it was good, I think. I buried him in a creek bed in Little Rock while our train was stopped there. We wrapped him in our old orphanage uniform dresses, and Ellie stayed in the compartment while I laid him to rest. Perhaps that is why she hasn't been able to heal. Maybe she never felt able to truly say goodbye to him. But she looked so exhausted when he died that I thought it best if she stayed on the train. She was asleep before I had even carried him through the doorway. Mason nodded. He decided then and there to create a small burial spot for Jacob, a place the girls could visit to honor their brother. He loved how Poppy placed flowers on Elizabeth's grave every day. Once Mason had created a burial area for Jacob, perhaps she could do the same for him. Ellie would then finally have somewhere to sit and say goodbye to the brother she had loved so much. 2 days later, Mason called the girls from the porch of the ranch house and asked them to walk with Rosie to Elizabeth's grave. The girls looked confused as they walked down the steps but obeyed Mason, following him to the small grassy plot with Rosie asleep in Poppy's arms. Both sisters gasped when they saw what he had done for them. Next to Elizabeth's grave stood a small cross made out of wood. It was laced through with sunflowers, and below it was a small wooden plaque with the words, "Jacob Brown, may he rest in peace," carved into it. "Oh, Mason," Poppy cried, turning and hugging her husband-to-be with one arm as she used the other to cradle Rosie. It was the first time they had ever made such close physical contact, and neither could ignore the spark of love and affection it rendered in them. As they stepped away, Mason couldn't help but notice the blush on Poppy's cheeks. Meanwhile, Ellie ran to the grave and began quietly crying as she traced Jacob's name with her fingers, caressing the wood with her touch. Mason and Poppy stood back and gave her space as she quietly said goodbye to her beloved sibling. Mason and Poppy returned to the house, allowing Ellie space. When she returned, she walked straight up the steps and into Mason's arms, hugging him and whispering a soft "thank you" in his ears. Mason was not an emotional man by nature, but he nearly wept with relief at finally hearing the sound of the young girl's voice. From that day on, Ellie seemed happier and spoke easily with Mason. His kind gesture had broken through her silence and allowed her to finally see him for the man he was, someone who truly wanted her to be a part of his family. That, coupled with finally being able to truly say goodbye to her brother, allowed Ellie to start the slow process of healing from her grief. Ellie began visiting Jacob and Elizabeth's graves every morning, assuming Poppy's task of laying flowers on the plots and offering up a quiet prayer. She seemed happier and began eating more, gaining weight, and filling out her dress. When Poppy saw that Ellie's bones were no longer showing through her gray wool gown, it reminded her that they both needed new outfits. Though Mason did not have much money, he had promised Poppy a few bolts of cloth with which to sew dresses and nightgowns for herself, Ellie, and Rosie. One day, after Mason had finished herding the cattle and tending to a heifer with an infected hoof, he took the girls to town on the horse and cart. Rose and Ellie picked out bolts of fabric for dresses. Poppy found a beautiful cornflower blue cotton that would make the perfect wedding dress, as well as beige lace muslin to use for nightgowns. The woman behind the fabric counter offered them a third bolt at a reduced price, and Ellie picked out a rosy pink that would be perfect to make dresses for little Rosie. Ellie helped to make a pattern, and together they spent their evenings beside the fire, sewing the long-sleeved gown. Rosie lay in the crib beside them, occasionally making cooing noises as the girls quietly chatted. Poppy's heart filled with joy at finally being able to speak freely to her sister as they had when they were younger. They reminisced about their childhood in the tenement, running around their parents' shop after closing time and playing dress-up with the discarded hats and pieces of fabric. At one point, Ellie stopped sewing and turned to look at her sister, the firelight turning her hair a vibrant orange gold. "Are you nervous to marry Mason?" she asked. Poppy turned to her sister, shook her head, and smiled. "No, I was when we first came here, but since I've come to know him, I've realized he's the perfect man for me. I might have met him through the newspaper, but I truly believe that God brought us together. I can't wait to be his wife." Ellie leaned back in her chair and smiled, happy that she and her sister had finally found comfort and happiness after so long without either. Chapter 18. As their wedding day approached, Poppy and Mason began planning what they would do when Elliot sold the ranch. They would stay in a tavern in town on the night before their wedding and travel directly to Houston after the ceremony. The journey would take some days and would require sleeping in the cart, but Mason was confident that in doing so, he could save enough money to buy them a good few head of cattle once they reached the city. His distant cousin lived there, and Mason had written to him, asking if he could work his ranch until he could settle elsewhere. On this morning, Mason was checking the entranceway post to the ranch when he encountered a strange man peering over the fence. "Pardon me, sir, but does Poppy Brown live here?" the strangely accented man asked. His accent wasn't quite English, but was removed from pure American. The man was older, perhaps in his 60s, with graying brown hair, and he wore small, round spectacles. The man's dress left no doubt about his wealth. His buttons were a gleaming silver, the The fabric of his suit jacket was a vibrant blank, not yet faded by excessive washing, and his shoes gleamed in the mid-morning sunlight. Mason wondered what such a man was doing on his property, asking after Poppy. Could he be a policeman sent by that horrible woman from the orphanage to arrest Poppy and Ellie? "Who's asking?" Mason answered, standing taller with his arms crossed over his chest in a posture he hoped would be intimidating. But the man appeared nonplussed, peering up at Mason with a smile on his face. He took off his hat and introduced himself. "I'm their uncle, David Brown. I was related to their father and only found out about his death, as well as their mother's, after the fact. I've been trying to track down the girls and Jacob for years, in the hopes of offering them the familial comforts I assume their life has sorely lacked since their parents' untimely deaths. I lived in England until very recently, and it's taken me some time to find the Brown children." When Mason did not immediately jump to open the gate for the man, David Brown added, "I mean Poppy, Eleanor, and Jacob no harm. I simply want to meet them. I've been trying to find them for years. It was only last week that I was finally able to gain information about the children's whereabouts." "And through whom did you discover their whereabouts?" Mason asked. "From a friendly nun by the name of Sister Miller. She works at St. Vincent's, that terrible place where the children lived after their parents died. I only wish I had found them sooner and spared them the time in that cold, dark place." "It was horrible," David Brown said, visibly shuddering as he recalled the orphanage. At the mention of Sister Miller, Mason's protective instincts began to relax. Poppy had talked frequently of Sister Miller, whom she described as being her only real friend other than her siblings. If Sister Miller told this man where Poppy and her siblings were headed, then this man must truly mean them no harm. Mason knew that Sister Miller wouldn't have divulged information to any person she did not trust. If Sister Miller trusted David Brown, then Mason was inclined to as well. A man who earned the trust of a nun must be a good man indeed. Mason nodded at David and opened the gate to gesture for him to come through. "Then you are welcome here. Come, I'll introduce you to Poppy and Ellie." Mason thought it best not to divulge Jacob's whereabouts straight away. He imagined that David Brown had dealt with enough just getting to Mapletree, without the added stress of finding out that one of his only remaining family members had come to a tragic end. Persenning. They could tell David later, once he was settled at the table and had spent some time with Poppy and Ellie and had the benefit of a proper meal in his belly. "Poppy? Ellie?" Mason called as he mounted the steps to the ranch house. He held the door open for David, and the men made their way into the main room. Poppy walked out of the bedroom, having just settled Rosie for a nap. When she noticed the man standing next to Mason, her guard immediately went up, and a question appeared in her eyes as she looked at her betrothed. He gave her a small nod that he hoped communicated to her that she had nothing to fear. Poppy relaxed slightly and turned back to the room, whispering to Ellie that they had a visitor. When both girls stood in front of David Brown, they noticed tears welling up in the old man's eyes. "Sir, are you all right?" Poppy couldn't help but ask. David nodded and took a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped at his eyes. Yes, I'm fine. It's just that you two look so much like your mother," he said, smiling through his tears. Poppy and Ellie looked shocked. Who was this man who knew their mother who had died so many years ago? Seeing their confusion, David stepped forward and offered his hand. "I apologize for my rudeness. I should have introduced myself right away. I'm David Brown, your uncle. I was your father's brother." Poppy stepped forward, and rather than shaking the man's hand, wrapped him in a hug. David looked surprised for a moment, but quickly responded, hugging Poppy close. Ellie stepped forward and joined in the hug, and for a moment the two girls stood with their long-lost uncle, embracing him and finding that he smelled much the same as their father always had, like tobacco and mint. It was a comforting smell that brought with it good memories. When David broke the hug, he held tightly to the hand of each girl and led them to the table near the stove. Mason took a chair by the fire and watched as David explained how he had come to find them in Mapletree. Once David had explained how he had returned from England and started the process of finding the children, he seemed to realize that one of the children he had been looking for was missing. Where is dear Jacob? Is he in the other room? Could I meet him? He asked Poppy and Ellie. Ellie's eyes teared up and a look passed between her and Poppy that told David that he would not like whatever they said next. He braced himself as Ellie opened her mouth. Jacob is dead, Uncle. Ellie went on to tell her uncle the tragic story behind Jacob's death, including Mrs. Julian's role in his passing. Small tears formed in David's eyes as he listened to the story, his sadness due in part to the death of his dear nephew, but also in part to the fact that his poor nieces and nephew had been forced to live with such a cruel woman for so long. You girls have suffered so much, David said when Ellie had finished speaking. He reached across the table and took each girl's hand and squeezed, hoping he could communicate just how sorry he was for not finding them earlier. Poppy smiled, but it was a sad smile. Though she was looking forward to marrying Mason, she knew that the journey ahead would be long and arduous. Yet another endurance she and Ellie would have to suffer through. It would help to have Mason to guide and protect them, but Poppy was truly tired of constantly having to struggle. She wished life could just be easy. Our suffering is not yet over, Uncle, Poppy said, withdrawing her hand and placing it in her lap. She told David about Elliot Turner and his plan to sell the ranch out from under Mason, leaving them homeless shortly before their wedding. David, who had looked so sad before, now sat up straighter, his face flushing red as outrage built within him. How dare he? How dare this man do that to you girls, to you, Mason? He raged, turning to look at Mason, who was sitting with his eyes cast down. After everything you've been through, for you three and that beautiful child to lose your home. It's preposterous, horrific. This Elliot Turner sounds like a monster. He is, Ellie cried. She couldn't help herself. She had been withholding her hatred of Elliot Turner since the day he had molested Poppy. But now, having finally been given the opportunity to express her feelings about the man, she didn't hold back. He's terrible. He's ruining our lives. I don't want to leave, she said, and then Ellie began to cry. David moved to comfort her, hugging her tight to his chest and letting her tears soak through the expensive fabric of his vest. Poppy began to tear up as well, and Mason gathered her in his arms. For a time, the men let the women cry, knowing they needed the release. Life had dealt them blow after blow without remorse. And now the girls were tired of the constant misery. They had been so happy these last few weeks at the ranch, and now they would be forced to leave the only place beside their childhood tenement that had ever felt like home. Ellie would have to leave Jacob's grave behind, and Poppy would have to abandon the crib she had spent so many nights rocking her precious Rosie to sleep in. It just wasn't fair. Ellie's sobs abated, and David handed her the handkerchief from his pocket. He looked up to see Mason whispering words of comfort in Poppy's ear. Their love for each other was clear, and David was glad that they had found each other. Mason was a quiet, stoic man, but he would make a fine husband for Poppy and a good brother to Ellie. The girls righted themselves and began to prepare lunch, while David sat back in his chair and pondered what he could do to ensure they didn't have to leave the ranch they so clearly loved. A plan was brewing in his mind, one he was certain would have the desired outcome. Chapter 19. The next morning, David woke early to the first rays of sun shining through the thin curtains and onto the cot that Poppy had prepared for him the previous night. David dressed quickly and made it quietly out the front door, intent on confronting Elliot Turner before the man had a chance to get in his cups. Mason had divulged Elliot's fondness for drink the night before, telling how he often began sipping on whiskey over breakfast. David hoped to catch the man early enough in order to speak to him before the alcohol turned him irrational and angry. Mason had taken David on a walk around the property late the previous afternoon, pointing out the horse barn, graves, cattle sheds, and the ranch house off in the distance that belonged to his ex-father-in-law. He's a mean, tired old man. He never got over Elizabeth, my first wife, dying, and blames me for her death. Well, he blames Rosie and me. Elizabeth died in childbirth, Mason had told him. David commiserated, knowing the personal loss that came with losing the love of one's life. David now walked with confidence towards Elliot Turner's house, walking up the steps to the porch just after the sun had fully crested over the horizon. He knocked gently on the door and was met with a grunt that sounded something like, "Be there in a minute," though he couldn't be sure. The voice was very muffled. After a few minutes, the front door swung open to reveal Elliot Turner, his hair a mess, his clothes wrinkled, and a cup of what David could only hope was coffee in one hand. "Who the hell are you, and what do you want?" Elliot shouted at David. "My name is David Brown. I'm Poppy and Ellie Brown's uncle, and I've come to discuss some business with you." Elliot peered at David for a moment before shutting the front door behind him and walking out onto the porch, his feet bare on the faded wood. "Those harlots over at Mason's house?" David blanched at the insult, but continued, intent on making Elliot see reason. "They are not harlots, but yes, they do reside with Mason. I hear you have plans to sell their home just before Mason and Poppy are due to marry. Is that correct?" "Damn right it is. Those whores don't belong in my Lizzie's house, and neither does that bastard and his offspring. I'm sick and tired of him pretending to be the owner of this ranch. I built this place from the ground up, I did, and then that hellion comes in and pretends he knows more about my cattle than I do. Well, no more. In a few days, the sale will have gone through with my solicitor, and they'll all be homeless and penniless, which is what they deserve." Elliot had stepped closer to David as he spoke, and now the men stood chest to chest. David looked down at Elliot with disgust, appalled that a man could be filled with so much hatred and vitriol. David had hoped to simply reason with him, but it was clear that such a tactic would not work. He would have to use something else, something much more persuasive: money. "Elliot, I will give you a choice. Either you take me to your solicitor and allow me to review the documents that supposedly make this sale legal, or you can go the easier route and allow me to buy you out of the ranch. I can offer you $2,000, which should be more than enough to allow you to start your life over somewhere far away from the family you so obviously don't want to be associated with." Elliot stepped back so suddenly that coffee spilled from his tin mug. "I accept," he shouted, and turned to open the front door, which he then slammed closed behind David. David smiled to himself as he took the long route back to the ranch house. He had amassed more money in England than he could possibly ever spend, and it gave him great pleasure to put it to good use. He had saved Poppy, Ellie, Mason, and Rosie from homelessness, and he planned to gift his share of the ranch to Mason, allowing Mason sole ownership of the Turner Ranch. It was obvious from the tour that Mason had taken him on of the property, that he ran the ranch well. David knew with certainty that given full ownership, Mason would be able to make more than enough money to support the girls and any children that were conceived of his marriage to Poppy. It warmed his heart to know that he would be helping to ensure the livelihood of the family for the rest of their days. David walked back into the ranch house to find Ellie at the stove, stirring porridge, and Poppy in the rocking chair with a large lump of blue cloth in her lap. Rosie was asleep in the crib beside her, and Mason was rocking the crib with his foot. They all looked up when David opened the door. "Where have you been, Uncle?" Ellie asked. "Ensuring that this house is yours forevermore," he answered. The girls and Mason looked perplexed. "What do you mean?" Poppy asked, her hands paused mid-stitch. David briefly explained the outcome of his conversation with Elliot Turner, promising to return to the man's house the next day with the necessary papers to sign to ensure that on their wedding day, Poppy and Mason had a home to come back to. Poppy jumped up from her chair and rushed to David, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. Ellie did the same, and for the second time in 2 days, the girls cried, but this time their tears were not of sorrow, but of joy and relief. "We can stay," Poppy shouted to Mason as she broke out of her uncle's embrace. She rushed to her husband-to-be and embraced him, and Mason laughed with joy. Little Rosie began to coo, and Poppy and Mason walked together to the crib, where Mason scooped Rosie up in his arms and began rocking her back and forth, whispering, we can stay," before looking up to David with clear gratitude in his eyes. Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means." "Yes, thank you so much, Uncle," Ellie said, still hugging him tightly. However, will we repay you? David shook his head. There is no need. All these years I've been looking for you girls in the hopes of taking care of you and your brother. Now I've finally been able to. I've fulfilled my life's quest, you might say. I need nothing else to be happy other than to see Poppy and Mason married in 2 days, he said, turning to look at the couple as they stood side by side, Rosie now asleep in Mason's arms, exhausted from all the excitement. Chapter 20. Poppy and Ellie spent the next 2 days frantically finishing Poppy's wedding dress, spending nearly every waking hour with a needle and thread in their hands. Elliot's solicitor arrived at the ranch house in his stead to prepare the paperwork necessary for the legal transfer of the property, and David was able to orchestrate it so that the property transferred directly to Mason. The finances were conducted, and the solicitor saw to it that all the I's were dotted and the T's crossed. On the morning of the wedding, David saw a large horse and cart carrying Elliot and all his worldly goods to the main road to town, which would hopefully take him far enough away for him never to slander or cause harm to David's nieces. Before the wedding ceremony, David presented Poppy with a thin pearl necklace he had purchased in town. "Your mother had one just like this when I first met her," he told Poppy as he secured the necklace around her neck. "I wanted you to have one just like it. You look so much like her, my dear." Poppy thanked him profusely and caressed the pearls gently with her fingers, glad to have something to remind her of her mother. David had also helped Mason find a suitable ring for Poppy in town. Together, they decided on a small gold band with filigree work etched into the gold. It was delicate and simple, and Mason thought would look beautiful on Poppy's finger. He kept the box in the pocket of his best black coat and checked throughout the morning that it was still there, fearful that he would forget it back at the ranch house. Mason remembered this anxiety from his wedding to Elizabeth. He had barely slept the night before their wedding, afraid that he would respond incorrectly when it came to the "I do's." Afraid Elizabeth would realize at the altar that he wasn't good enough for her. But now, Mason's anxiety came from the desire to have the wedding over and done with so Poppy could finally be his wife. He knew they were meant to be together, that he would be calm and collected at the altar. He simply wanted her to be his wife as soon as possible. Poppy was similarly anxious for the deed to be done as she rode in the cart with her family to the church. She had finished her wedding dress the night before and felt beautiful in the blue gown that accentuated her small waist and brought out the color of her eyes. The gown and the pearls brought her closer to her departed mother, and for the first time since before her parents' death, as Poppy looked around her at her home in Maple Tree and her family in the cart beside her, she felt at peace. Yes, Jacob was gone, as were her parents, but Poppy had finally found a home with Mason, Ellie, and Rosie. She knew that her Uncle David would be returning to England eventually, but she also knew that the bond they shared would never be broken. Mason helped the girls down from the cart after they had come to a stop in front of the church. Ellie was extra careful of her dress as she stepped down onto the dusty earth. She wore her gray gown, enhanced with lace detailing on the collar and cuffs, with ribbons sewn onto the bottom. The dress had been transformed from a drab but comfortable number into an elegant outfit suitable for a wedding. Rosie wore the pink dress that Ellie had sewed for her, with a matching hat that protected her soft head from the winter sun, which was still strong even in December. Ellie held Rosie in her arms, while Mason and Poppy walked toward the front of the church. Her Uncle David led her to a seat in the front pew, and the ceremony began. By the end, everyone, the priest included, was wiping a tear from their eye, so clear was the connection between the bride and groom and their happiness at finally being wed. Poppy had whooped with joy when the priest told her she was officially Mrs. Brodie, and Mason had taken her in his arms and pressed the sweetest, softest kiss to her lips in a show of affection that made it clear how truly he loved her. After the ceremony, the wedding party continued on the ranch, where all the guests celebrated well into the night. Early in the evening, David turned to Poppy and slipped her a small envelope bearing her name in his characteristic scrawl. "This is for you, my dear Poppy," he whispered. Poppy opened it to find a letter from David's solicitor informing her that she was to be paid an allowance of $50 per month for the rest of her adult life. "Uncle David, this is too much. You've already done so much for us," Poppy whispered. He really was too generous. He had already helped save her home and had told her and Ellie enough stories about their parents to fuel many sessions of reminiscing and remembering for years to come. "Nonsense, my dear. I want to be sure that no matter what happens, you girls are cared for. Allow an old man to take care of the women in his life." Poppy leaned over and kissed David on the cheek before pocketing the envelope in her small reticule. Ellie gave her a questioning look, but Poppy motioned that she would share details of the contents of the envelope later. She could already imagine Ellie's eyes widening as she looked at the sum of money. Poppy had never held more than a nickel in her hand before. The idea of $50 being at her disposal each month was unfathomable. After the guests had left, Ellie wowed the family with a beef stew that surpassed any she had made before. They happily supped in silence, the only noise being Rosie's excited mms whenever Poppy fed her a spoonful of stew. After supper, Poppy and Mason went for a walk while Ellie napped in her room. Rosie and David sat by the fire, reading the book he had brought with him from England. It was a collection of English poetry, and reading it reminded him how much he missed the cloudy moors of the country he had called home for so long. It was nearly time to return, and though David would miss his nieces, he knew he needed to leave them to bond and become a true family. Only 2 more tasks remained for him to accomplish first. The day after Poppy and Mason's wedding, David took the train back to Chicago. The journey was peaceful, and he spent much of it looking out the window at the landscape. He had made sure to ask after a certain Alan and his sister Eliza, who were employed by the railway company before securing his ticket, to be certain that at least one of the two would be on board the train he boarded. David sought out Alan at the refreshment carriage not too long before the train was to reach its destination. He explained his association with the family of siblings he had assisted not too long before on their trip westward and handed him an envelope which he explained was their show of gratitude for all the kindness and help he and his sister had shown. When the train arrived in Chicago, David went directly to St. Vincent's Orphanage, where he hoped to find Sister Miller still in residence. To David's delight, Sister Miller opened the door in response to his knock on the old hardwood. "Mr. Brown," she exclaimed, ushering him in and out of the bitter wind that whipped through the Chicago streets. "Hello, Sister Miller. I have come with news of Poppy and Ellie." Sister Miller led David to the kitchen, where she had been peeling potatoes for that evening's supper. The orphanage was eerily quiet, and David heard none of the sounds of the orphanage mistress's hard shoes clacking against the tile floor that he had noticed on his last visit to St. Vincent's. "Please, tell me how my dear friends are. I have been praying and praying these last few weeks for their safe arrival in Maple Tree." He prosed 10%. David sat down across from where Sister Miller stood and relayed the recent happenings with his nieces. He also told Sister Miller of Jacob's death, which elicited a tearful nod from her. "I assumed as much. He was so weak and bleeding so much when they left for the train. I suspected that without proper medical care, he would not survive the journey. How horrible for Poppy to have to bury her own brother without ceremony. And poor Ellie. She and Jacob were thick as thieves during their time here. They were best friends." "Yes, and it has taken Ellie some time to heal after his death, but she seems much improved. Mason, Poppy's husband, built a small grave for Jacob that Ellie visits regularly, and I think that Rosie, Mason's daughter, has also given Ellie something to focus on." Sister Miller nodded. "Yes, while it is tragic about Jacob, I am so glad to hear my friends are doing well. They deserve love and a comfortable home. They were sorely lacking in both during their time here, as so many of the children are. I am sure you have realized, Mr. Brown, that St. Vincent's is not a particularly charitable place, despite its origins." "Yes, and that is precisely why I have come to see you, sister. I would like you to please educate me on the orphanage. I want to know about its beginnings. I would like to have an in-depth look into the buildings and how the children are housed here. I want to know about the food and the education the children receive." "Well?" Sister Miller responded with a heavy sigh. "Give me some time to educate myself more fully on the history of St. Vincent's and how it has come to be what you see today. After prayers, I should be ready to tell you all you need to know. I can take you on a tour of the buildings now, if you like." "Thank you, sister. I would be most grateful for your time." With that, the habited nun and the wealthy gentleman could be seen traipsing purposefully through the cold passageways, halls, and rooms within the ominous hulk of gray that was St. Vincent's. "It is sadly unfortunate, Mr. Brown, that the likes of Mrs. Julian, who have no capacity for love or even a modicum of empathy for the vulnerable children in their care, have been allowed to bring to its knees what was at the outset a haven of love and caring," Sister Miller explained. "Is there a way to right the wrongs imposed so maliciously by the likes of Mrs. Julian? That is the crux of the matter. Is it not, sister? Can the children who have no one and nothing in this world, who rely on the benevolence of others and on a system of social care that has their best interests at heart, ever hope to receive the care they so deserve?" "I am pleased to tell you that Mrs. Julian has indeed resigned. 3 days ago, in fact. Her reason for leaving, as she cited, was the stress she endured as a result of Poppy, Ellie, and Jacob's escape. She said that it was all simply too much for her to bear," Sister Miller told David as they climbed the stone stairs to the boys' dormitories. "The best news I could ever have hoped to hear." David could not keep the excited delight from his tone at the news. Nor could he avoid the depression that blanketed him as he moved through the children's dormitories. The lifelessness of the orphanage left him cold and hopeless. He could only imagine the feelings it must have incited within the hearts and minds of those hapless little ones who were forced to call it home. He found himself disillusioned, despite holding out hope that the institution might not have been quite as incompetent as he had first suspected. It was Sister Miller who gave him cause to hold out for such hope. He was sure that many more like her must work at the orphanage, loving and caring for the little ones in the manner they deserved. Unfortunately, the malevolence of the bad apples within the administration, such as Mrs. Julian, seemed to outweigh all the good done by the likes of Sister Miller. Try as he might to find the potential and the good aspects of the orphanage as he walked through it with the sister, it continuously fell short of his expectations. Thoroughly despondent, David thanked Sister Miller for giving up her time to show him around St. Vincent's. She invited him to come back later that afternoon when she promised to have more of the history of St. Vincent's to share with him. He hoped to get a better understanding of the orphanage and its motives, means, and original intentions from the information he was certain the sister would impart. He spent the afternoon deep in thought as he waited for the clock to edge to the time he would again see the sister and hear all she had to tell him. Sister Miller, meanwhile, was up against not a little opposition from within the bounds of the orphanage, as she sought to find out as much as she could about St. Vincent's. Since Miss Julian's sudden and unexpected departure, moods had been high, although the general feel of the place was most certainly lighter. It was with much determination that she read through records and asked the older nuns to regale their tales of the orphanage in its beginning years. When at last Sister Miller sat down with David in the public library in the center of Chicago, she had a great deal to tell. St. Vincent Home for Children had a cholera epidemic to thank for its existence, as well as a fire. Before 1832, Chicago was but a village and home to just a small group of families. These families supported one another through whatever forms of adversity they were unfortunate to have to deal with. So it was that any orphaned children found refuge with neighbors. The south bank of the river that runs through Chicago was empty of buildings of any kind apart from the fort, really. The land here was low, just a wet prairie that stretched back from Lake Michigan. In 1931, all that made up the settlement were a smattering of buildings and Fort Dearborn. Fort Dearborn was thrown up on the south bank of the Chicago River in 1803 and was just a wooden stockade at the mouth of the river. This was the westernmost outpost of the United States Army, heralding the first real investment on new federal land hereabouts. Among the few buildings that eventually became a settlement as Europeans and European Americans set up home around and about the fort was John Kinsey's fur trading post. John Kinsey founded the first Episcopal church in Chicago, and he and his wife were charter members on the board of the Chicago Orphan Asylum in 1849. Mr. and Mrs. John Kinsey had 7 children of their own and had taken in their orphan nieces, nephews, and cousins as well by 1849 when the Chicago Orphan Asylum saw its doors open to the needy. The destitute children who called this community that was to burgeon into Chicago, the city probably received care and shelter in much the same way as the Kinsey relatives had back in these times. When the dreaded cholera called on Chicago in 1849, it was not the first time it brought with it loss to the region. But this time, Chicago had grown from a small village, and arrangements that had been adequate when cholera struck the first time were no longer suitable to provide for the shelter of those young ones orphaned by the disease. This round of cholera was to take more than 4,000 of those who called the city home. Only 2 types of child custody existed before the asylum: indenture to families and commitment to the poorhouse. Children did find good homes through indentures, but the unlucky among them entered into what was tantamount to child serfdom. Unsupervised indenture was pretty much a gamble, with the child's welfare subject purely to chance. Committing the children to the alternative, which was the poorhouse, meant that they rubbed shoulders with the worst of the city's adults within the repressive and miserable environs they were forced to share. Immigrants arriving by the shipload had brought the disease to the city, and the disease had brought the city to its knees. Business came to a stand. Families were left parentless. Children took to the streets to earn what little they might to survive by any means they could find. The new county poorhouse was too full to accept new admissions. When parents were taken by cholera, their surviving children had nowhere to go. As if that was not enough, a fire that started in the same year aboard a steamboat at the levee orphaned many children from St. Louis. Diocesan orphanages were crowded. An appeal for help was answered with the building of the new orphanage in 1850 under the auspices of the newly formed German St. Vincent Orphan Association. In 1851, it was overseen by 5 sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet. Anna Schwert was the first orphan to call it home, arriving as she did on the 25th of July that very year. Within 2 months, about 30 children called St. Vincent's home. David was astounded, and he had heard more than enough. He stood up, pushing his seat back, and walked around the small table at which he and the sister were seated inside the library. From his inner coat pocket, he took an envelope much like the one he had given Poppy on her wedding day and Alan before disembarking on the train. Please use this to transform this orphanage into a place of love, laughter, and warmth. The children here need it so desperately, and I think you are just the person to provide for them, sister. Sister Miller opened the envelope, and the color drained from her face. Mr. Brown, I could never accept this money. It's so generous of you, but I simply can't. You must. From all I have seen, meeting you, and all Poppy and Ellie have told me, you are the person fit to run this home. Use this money to banish those terrible orphanage mistresses and masters and ensure that all the children here are looked after properly. Please, Sister Miller. Sister Miller nodded and slipped the envelope into a secret pocket in her cassock. As you wish, Mr. Brown. Splendid, David said. And with that terrible woman Julian already gone, you will have one less person to banish. Sister Miller smiled at him and accepted his offer to return with her to the orphanage to help her with her chores, since he had taken so much of her time. Once they were inside St. Vincent's, he rolled up his sleeves and grabbed a knife to help her peel the potatoes. He remained at the orphanage all afternoon, helping Sister Miller prepare supper for the orphans and joining them to eat it. The orphanage masters looked on with malice and confusion. David returned to Britain but made biannual trips to Chicago and Maple Tree, during which he would spoil the orphans with books and sweets and spend long summer days helping Mason at the ranch and looking after Rosie. 3 years later, Poppy and Mason welcomed a beautiful baby boy into their home, whom they named David Jacob Brown Brodie. Ellie gradually came back to her old self, chattering excitedly about anything and everything. Rosie grew older, and Ellie became her eager companion, teaching the girl how to sew, cook, and read, while Poppy helped David take his first steps and say his first words. The ranch prospered, allowing Mason to hire more ranch hands, which allowed him to spend more time with his new family. He and Poppy grew more in love with each passing day, and many nights, Mason went to bed next to his wife, thanking God for the Chicago Tribune and its mail-order bride advertisements. Without them, he never would have found Poppy, and he never would have welcomed his beautiful baby boy into the world. He might have only signed up for a bride to take care of his house and child, but in Poppy, Mason had found so much more. He had found the love of his life, a sentiment that Poppy readily shared.